The crystal was warm in a world where everything else was as cold as ice. He touched it simply to feel something alive, and the stone lit up. Blue lines crept across the table like veins. Black dots began to move in the water, and he suddenly realized he was reading it like a familiar map. But let's go back a few hours. The cold hits his lungs like a fist. Daniel Kang opens his eyes and sees a gray sky, a wet rock beneath his back, salt in his mouth. He's lying on a stone staircase in the middle of the ocean and doesn't understand where he is. The thing he remembers: steam, a wave. Someone's thought that someone had measured the pressure incorrectly. Then darkness. Then this. He sits up and immediately realizes the body is not his own. The hands are rougher than his own, palms with calluses he's never had. The shoulders are broader, clothes made of thick fabric soaked in salt. A brass tag dangles from his neck. He turns it over with his fingers. Letters are stamped into the metal. Warden, Quran, life sentence. He reads it 3 times. The letters aren't English. He's never seen any like them. But for some reason, he understands every one. And that is the first thing that strikes him as utter nonsense. The second he sees when he looks down. 3 sailors are rowing from the shore and don't look back once. Their backs are tense. The oars strike the water evenly and quickly, as if they're in a hurry to get far away. One throws a sack overboard. The sack sinks beneath the water. He wants to shout. He opens his mouth, but his voice is still unfamiliar, and only a rasp escapes his throat. The boat doesn't slow down. No food, no water, not a single word of explanation. They simply unloaded him onto the rock and left him there. He raises his head. A tower looms above him, gray stone darkened by the water, 30 meters high, and not a single door at the base. A staircase winds up the outer wall like a snake coiled around a pillar. The steps are narrow and wet from the spray. The wind blows from the northeast and smells of iron. He stands up. His knees are shaking. He looks out at the sea, gray as far as the eye can see. No shore, no sails, no smoke. The island beneath his feet is the size of 2 football fields. Rocks, moss, puddles of rainwater in the potholes of the rock. And the tower. There is nowhere to go but up. He climbs. The steps are narrow. The wind hits his back and tries to tear him from the wall. He presses his shoulder against the rock and crawls upward. On the 20th step, he turns around. The boat has already shrunk to a dot. On the 40th, he stops counting. His legs are burning. He's gasping for breath. And then, on some step, the wind suddenly dies down, and silence falls. Not an empty silence, not the absence of sound, the presence of something else, as if the tower is listening to him. He freezes, his heart is pounding. Then he climbs further. He enters a circular room at the top, a stone floor, stone walls, narrow windows facing all 4 directions. In the center, a stone table with an engraved surface. Lines, contours. It looks like a map, but without a single label. Above the table, in an iron frame, hangs a crystal the size of a fist. Dark, dead. A candle stub and a piece of rope lie nearby. There is nothing else in the room. No bed, no blanket, no book. He walks around the room in a circle. He touches the walls, cold as a grave. He touches the table. It's cold too. He looks out the windows one by one. To the south, the ocean. To the west, the ocean. To the north, the ocean. To the east, the ocean and a thin dark streak of something on the horizon. Maybe land, maybe a cloud. He returns to the table. The crystal hangs before him, dark and indifferent, and he reaches for it, just to touch something that isn't stone. His fingers rest on the edge, and it glows from within. Not a flash. The light flows like ink in water. Blue, azure, deep ultramarine. The table beneath him comes to life. Blue swirls emerge like veins on the back of a hand. Red arcs stretch from edge to edge. Black dots flicker in several places. They move, slowly, but they move. He pulls his hand away, the light remains, and this is where the strangest part begins. He recognizes all of this. Blue lines, isobars, lines of equal pressure, red arcs, atmospheric fronts, warm masses colliding with cold ones, black dots, something alive, something big in the water. He did this every day for 7 years, and his brain reads the data on its own without any effort. A low-pressure system is brewing to the northwest. A front is coming from the south. He estimates the speed based on the distance between the isobars. Collision in 36 hours, plus minus 4. A storm. Not a catastrophe, but a serious problem. 6 on the Beaufort scale. He sinks to the floor with his back to the table. Facing the window, beyond which the gray sky merges with the gray sea, and he wheezes out, "Oh, this is my job." No one answers. The wind howls outside the window, and for the first time in this crazy day, he stops being afraid. Because a pressure map remains a pressure map, in any world, in any universe. The atmosphere obeys the laws of physics, and he knows physics. He jumps up, leans over the table again, leans lower. To the west, the isobars are closer together. The gradient is steep. That means the wind will be fiercer there. The front curves. It's not a straight line, but a wave. That means 6 hours after the main blow, a secondary gust will come. There are 3 black dots, 2 far to the south, 1 closer, and it's creeping straight toward the low-pressure zone. He doesn't know what these creatures are, but he knows one thing. They're heading where the storm will be. Either they sense it, or the storm is drawing them in. He makes a mental note of this. He looks around. He has nothing to write it down with. He grabs a piece of rope from the floor. He uncoils it. The fibers are stiff. He dips the end into a puddle on the windowsill and scratches it against the stone. Roughly, crookedly, but legibly. Date unknown, he writes. Day 1, low pressure in the northwest. A front from the south. Impact in 36 hours. A secondary surge in 6. 3 objects in the water. 1 is heading straight into the storm. He looks at his scribbles, wet, crooked letters on the gray stone. The first record in the history of Karen Island. He doesn't know that. He's just doing what he's been doing his whole life. Reading data and writing it down. Night falls quickly. The temperature plummets. He lies down on the cold floor, pulling his knees up to his chest. He wraps himself in the raincoat he was wearing. The raincoat smells of salt and something sour. The crystal above him glows with a soft blue light, like a nightlight, like a monitor screen in an empty night control room. He closes his eyes and remembers Seattle. 12 screens. Coffee in a paper cup. The hum of the air conditioner. Marcus's voice from the next shift. Data from the buoys in Alaska. All of that was real. All of that was his life. And now his life is a stone room at the top of a tower in the middle of an ocean that shouldn't exist. He falls asleep. He sleeps poorly. The stone is hard and cold. He startles awake several times from the wind, and once from a sound, a low hum from beneath the water, distant, deeper than a ship's horn. He sits up, looks at the map. The nearest black dot has shifted northward. Now it's where, in a day, the storm will hit. The rumbling subsides. He lies back down. In the morning, the sun beats through the east window, right into his face. He sits up. His body aches. His back, his neck, his arms. He walks over to the table. The map has changed. The front has advanced. The isobars have closed in. The storm is gathering strength. No longer 36 hours. 30, maybe 28. He updates his notes on the floor. Day 2. The front is accelerating. The impact in 28 hours. And for the first time, he goes downstairs. In daylight, the staircase is even scarier than at dusk. Narrow, no railing. The stone is slippery from the spray. He walks slowly, holding onto the wall. Downstairs, he goes around the island. It takes 20 minutes. Cliffs, rocks, moss. On the south side, a small cove. Natural. The water near the shore looks about 3 meters deep, enough for a boat, maybe even a schooner. And right there on the shore, he finds traces. Someone had been here before him. Stonework, remnants of a wall, a fire pit, fish bones, a rusty iron hook driven into the rock. The previous caretaker, or whoever was here before him. He doesn't know how many people were here before him. He doesn't know what became of them. The tag around his neck speaks to this. Life sentence. He finds a source of fresh water, a crack in the rock on the eastern slope, a thin trickle, cold, clean. He drinks for a long time. Then he cups his hands and washes his face. He finds mussels on the rocks in the tidal zone. He picks a few and eats them raw. The taste is disgusting, but it's food. He heads back up. He climbs more slowly than he descended. His legs are shaking. At the top, he places his hand on the crystal. Warm. The map has updated. The front is even closer. 24 hours. And the black dot that was heading north has vanished. It just disappeared from the map. He doesn't know what that means. It went deep, or died, or the map can't see it that far away. He makes a note. Day 2, evening. Biosignature 3 is gone, cause unknown. The 2 remaining are stable in the south. A storm comes at night. First, a harbinger. The wind picks up, the tower hums, The windows have no glass, and the wind blows inside. He huddles in the corner between the table and the wall. Rain lashes diagonally against the windows. By morning, the floor is wet. He is wet. But the tower stands firm. It has stood for 1,000 years and has withstood this night. The main blow strikes during the day, exactly at the time he calculated, plus or minus 2 hours from the first forecast. At noon, the sky turns black. The sea rises like a wall. Waves crash against the rocks so hard that the tower shakes. And he sits at the table and looks at the map. The map shows the storm from the inside, a pressure spiral, wind currents. It's beautiful, terrifying and beautiful, as if you were watching a hurricane from a satellite, only you're standing right in its heart. The storm rages for 6 hours, then it subsides. 4 hours later, a secondary surge arrives, exactly as he predicted, stronger, more vicious. Another 3 hours, then silence. By sunset, the sky clears. He stands by the west-facing window above the wet orange ocean. He is alive. The forecast came true. In this world, physics works just like back home. The atmosphere obeys the same laws. And the crystal feeds him data cleaner and faster than any buoys from Seattle. In real time. No delays, no interference in the channel. And for the first time in 3 days, he isn't thinking about how he got here. He's thinking about what he can do here. A week passes, then another. He establishes a routine, up at dawn, down to the water, gathering mussels, water, back up, reading the map, recording data. At first he writes with strands of rope. Then he finds a piece of coal on the shore and writes more easily. The rings of his writing cover the floor around the table. A new line every day. Pressure, temperature, fronts, creature locations. 14 days worth of data. Not much, but something is already emerging. Fronts come from the southwest more often than from other directions. Large creatures coincide with low-pressure zones 7 times out of 10. The current off the eastern shore changes twice a day. Tidal. Predictable. He's hungry. Mussels and rainwater aren't a life, just survival. He's lost weight. His hands have become sinewy, but his mind works even better than it did in Seattle. Maybe because there are no distractions. No phone, no news, no Marcus with his fishing stories. Just data and the ocean. On the 14th day, Dan saw a sail on the map, a small dot, not a biosignature, another marker, warm, reddish, moving from the southwest, a ship. Dan stood at the table and watched as the dot slowly approached. The course was erratic, jagged. The ship was changing direction every few minutes. These weren't maneuvers. It was a person who didn't know where they were going, lost. Dan looked at the barometric chart. A front was forming from the northeast. Not the strongest, but not weak either. In about 8 hours, it would reach this area. If the ship kept wandering, it would be hit head-on. Dan looked at the crystal. The crystal glowed steadily. A beacon can flash. Dan already knew that. If you cover the crystal with your palm, the light on the outside goes out. Take your palm away, and the light returns. He'd tried this on the 3rd day just out of boredom. 2 signals. Light on, light off. That wasn't much, but enough to attract attention. Dan began to flash. Fast, fast, slow. Fast, fast, slow. Over and over. Not Morse code, just a rhythm. Look this way. I'm here. Look this way. He flashed for an hour. The dot on the map twitched. It turned. Slowly but surely, it headed toward Karan. Dan kept flashing until his hand ached. Then he switched to the other one. By evening, he saw the ship with his own eyes. Not a ship, a schooner. Small, worn. 2 sails, 1 torn. The hull dark with seaweed. It entered the bay from the south, clumsily. It scraped its side against a rock. The anchor fell with a crash. Dan went down. For the first time in 2 weeks, he was going down not for mussels, but to people. 3 men disembarked from the schooner. An old man with a face the color of tanned leather, broad-shouldered, bow-legged, an axe at his belt. 2 younger men beside him. All 3 looked up at the tower, then at Dan. The old man stepped closer, stopped 3 paces away. Small eyes, sharp, appraising. Dan spoke first. He said he could tell by their schooner that they'd lost their course at least 2 days ago. He said they had salted fish in the hold, about 2 tons by draft. He said they were heading southwest to some port. The old man didn't interrupt. Only his eyes narrowed even more. Dan continued. He said that by 10 o'clock tonight from the northeast, the wind will be force 7. He saw the schooner heel as it entered the bay. The seam on the port side is wet. The mainsail won't hold. If they set out now, they'll be caught in the storm on the open sea. Better to stay until morning. The front will pass during the night. In the morning, there'll be a 6-hour window of calm weather. Course, northwest-west. Dan fell silent. The old man was silent too. Then he looked up at the sky. Clear, not a cloud in sight. The wind was light. Nothing suggested a storm. The old man spat on the rocks. He said Dan was a young fool. He turned and walked toward the rowboat. The two young men followed him. The schooner weighed anchor and left the bay. Dan stood on the shore and watched it sail away. He went up to the tower, sat down at the table, looked at the map. The schooner's position was moving southwest. The front was coming from the northeast. The lines were converging. Dan could do nothing. He watched the clock. By 9 o'clock in the evening, the front was already close. The wind outside had picked up. Dan flashed the lighthouse. Long flashes, short pauses. Come back, come back, come back. At 10 o'clock, the sky in the northeast darkened. At 11, the wind howled. The schooner's dot on the map stopped. Then it twitched. Then it began moving back toward Karan, slowly, in jerks. Dan didn't move from the window. Rain lashed his face. He peered into the darkness. At midnight, he saw a light, an oil lamp on the schooner's bow. It was heading for the cove, crooked, listing, but it was moving. It entered the cove at 1 o'clock in the morning. The anchor dropped. Dan went down in the rain. The old man climbed up the wet rocks, without an axe, in a torn raincoat, soaked through. He set a barrel down in front of Dan, salted cod. He said hoarsely that the mainsail had burst, just as Dan had said, and that he was probably a fool himself. Dan took the barrel, heavy, 20 kilos, the first real food in 2 weeks. He told the old man there would be a window in the morning, course northwest-west, 6 hours. The old man nodded. Then he asked Dan his name. Dan told him. The old man said his name was Hyung-gu, captain of the schooner. The name of the schooner was a complicated word that Dan translated for himself as spark, a small fire. There they stood in the rain, two wet men next to a barrel of cod, and that was the beginning of it all. In the morning, the rain stopped. The sky cleared, just as Dan had predicted. The wind was light. The window opened. Hyung-gu climbed up to Dan in the tower. For the first time, someone but Dan had ever stood in that room. The old man looked at the glowing map. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked what it was. Dan explained, simply, without unnecessary words. The blue lines are air pressure. The red ones are the boundaries between warm and cold air. Where they meet, there is a storm. The black dots are something alive in the water, something big. Hyung-gu listened. Then he pointed his finger at one of the black dots to the south. He asked, Leviathan. Dan didn't know that word. Hyung-gu explained, ancient creatures in the depths. They sense ships, they capsize them, they sink them. Every sailor knows, every sailor fears. Dan nodded. He made a mental note. The black dots are Leviathans. Hyung-gu looked at the map for another minute. Then he turned to Dan and said he had 3 friends in the port of Ilam. Captains too, fishermen too. They've been afraid to go out to sea for 2 years now. The dead season. Storms don't follow the charts. Routes have become deadly. People are starving. If Dan can do what he does, if his map isn't lying, then Hyung-gu will bring them here, Dan thought. He asked what they could bring. Hyung-gu listed it. Wood, nails, ropes, fabric for sails, fresh water in barrels, maybe flour. Dan nodded. He said he needed something else. Paper and ink. Hyung-gu looked at him strangely, but he nodded. The ship set sail on a northwest-west course at 8 in the morning. Dan stood by the west window and watched the schooner leave. The dot on the map moved steadily, confidently. The front had moved east. The window was clear. The spark would make it. Dan turned to the table. He was alone, again, but now he had a barrel of cod and a promise. For the next 7 days, Dan worked. He marked out the bay with stones, large boulders at the edges of the entrance, landmarks, so the ship could enter even in the dark. He cleared a space on the shore, removed the large rocks, made a sort of path from the water to the base of the tower. He studied the map. Every day, every hour. The markings on the floor multiplied. Dan discovered that if he held his palm on the crystal longer, the map revealed more details. Water temperature, current direction, salinity. He didn't know how the crystal measured salinity, but the data was there, and it made sense. Cold currents from the north, warm ones from the southwest. Where they met, nutrients rose to the surface. There were fish there. That's also where the leviathans were most often found. Logical. Predators go where the food is. Dan marked the areas of high fish concentration on the stone floor. If a fisherman knows where the fish are, he doesn't need to wander the sea for weeks. He can go out, catch them, come back. Less time at sea, less risk. On the sixth day after Lucina's departure, Dan invented a code. Not Morse code, simpler. A short flash is a dot, a long one is a dash. The combinations meant simple words: storm, safe, north, south, east, west, fish, danger. 8 words, enough to start with. He flashed these combinations into the void. He practiced. He built up speed. His fingers got used to the rhythm. Close the crystal. Open, close, open. On the 7th day, sails appeared on the horizon. 4 of them. The Torch was in the lead. Behind it were 3 schooners, larger, heavier. Dan watched them approach and felt something strange in his chest. Not joy, not relief. Something similar to what he felt in the control room when the Alaskan fishing fleet confirmed receipt of the storm warning. Communication. The signal got through. Someone heard it. 4 schooners entered the bay. It was tight, side by side, but they made it in. Hyung-gu disembarked first. The captains followed him. 3 men of different ages. They all looked at the tower with the expression people have when they look at things that shouldn't exist. Hyung-gu had brought everything he'd promised: wood, nails, ropes, flour, 2 barrels of fresh water, and paper, thick, yellowish, and a bottle of ink. Dan took the paper and ink first. The captains exchanged glances. Hyung-gu smirked. He told them that the caretaker was strange but useful. Dan took all 4 of them upstairs. He showed them the map, explained what the lines meant, showed them the notes on the floor. 2 weeks' worth of data. One of the captains asked if Dan could tell them where it was safe to head south right now. Dan looked at the map. He calculated. He said that right now the southern corridor between the 20th and 25th miles from Karan was clear. No fronts, no leviathans, a fair wind, a 10-hour window. The captain asked, "And then?" Dan said that later a band of fog would come in from the west. Not a storm, just fog, but thick. Visibility would drop to 0. Better to turn back before it settles in. The captain was silent. Then he said that in the port of Ilam, they pay in silver for words like that. Dan replied that he didn't need silver yet. He needed hands. To help build a pier, a proper one, wooden, so the ships wouldn't scrape their sides against the rocks. The captains looked at each other. Hyung-gu nodded first. The rest followed suit. The next morning, 12 men from 4 schooners were driving piles into the rocky bottom of the bay. Dan stood on the shore and showed them where to place the supports. He had calculated the depth from the map, the current in the bay, the direction of the waves with a southerly wind. The pier had to be built not where it was convenient, but where it wouldn't be smashed by the first storm. By evening, 6 piles were in place, crooked, rough, but they stood. Dan climbed up to the tower. He opened the first page of the paper. He dipped a piece of a sharpened stick into the ink. He wrote, "Observation Journal, Karen Island, Caretaker Daniel Kang." And he began transferring the data from the stone floor to the paper. Carefully, systematically, day by day. Hammers clattered below. People were building the pier. Upstairs, Dan was building an archive. He didn't know which was more important, but he suspected it was the archive. In the 3rd week, Hinari Hyun went ashore on Karen and didn't return. She had sailed with her father on the Luchin as part of the 2nd group. 5 schooners this time. Hyun brought people with him, not just captains, a carpenter, 2 women who knew how to smoke fish, an old net maker with trembling hands but precise fingers, and his daughter. Dan saw her from the upper deck. Among everyone who came ashore, she was the only one not looking at the tower. She was looking at the water, at how the wave entered the cove, at how the ebb tide exposed the rocks, at how the current swirled at the left edge of the entrance. She was reading the cove, just as Dan read a map, only with her eyes and skin. Hinari climbed up to the tower on the 2nd day. Dan was sitting at the table, poring over his notes. She entered silently. She stood beside him. She looked at the map. She didn't ask anything. Then she said the entrance to the cove needed to be widened. The rock on the right could be broken. She knew how. It would take fire and cold water. The rock would crack. Dan looked at her. He asked how she knew. Hinari said she had been breaking rocks since she was 10. The cove in their village was just as narrow. Her father made her clear the entrance every season. Dan nodded. Then he asked something else. He asked how the Lucina had entered the storm that first evening, what the list had been, from which side the wind had struck, how the hull had behaved on the waves, exactly where the mainsail had burst. Hinari paused. She looked at him intently. No one had ever asked her about that before. The men on board had weathered the same storm, but none of them would have described it the way she did, because none of them felt the boat the way she did. Hinari spoke for 20 minutes. Dan took notes. Every word. The list to starboard in a crosswave, the delay before writing, the vibration in the hull in winds above force 6, the weak spot at the seam on the port side. Exactly where he'd said it was during their first meeting. When she finished, Dan reread his notes. Then he said it was valuable data. For the first time, he had information about the vessel's actual behavior under real conditions. His chart showed the weather from above, and Hinari had told him what the weather looked like from the inside, from the deck. He said he needed more stories like that, from her and from other captains. Every voyage, every storm, every unusual wind. Hinari was silent. Then she asked why. Dan explained. If he knows how a specific boat behaves in a specific wind, he can give not a general forecast, but a precise one. Not just a 6-force wind, but a 6-force wind, and your boat is better off sailing at a 20-degree angle degrees to the wave, because otherwise the heel will be critical. Hinari looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was strange, but that she would stay. Someone had to make sure he didn't fall down the stairs while reading his scribbles. She stayed. In the first week, she organized the widening of the bay's entrance. The method worked. Build a fire at the base of the rock. Wait for it to heat up. Splash it with seawater. The rock cracked with a crunch that made the whole bay shudder. They hauled the pieces away with ropes. In 5 days, the entrance had widened by 2 meters. Now 2 schooners could enter side by side. Dan watched from above. He noted in his journal how the current in the cove changed after each widening. The data confirmed it. The entrance was wider. The current was weaker. The waves inside the bay were lower, better for anchoring. Hinari brought him food upstairs, morning and evening. A bowl of porridge, a piece of smoked fish, a mug of fresh water. Dan ate without looking up from the map, and often forgot to eat until Hinari returned an hour later and found the full bowl on the windowsill. She scolded him, loudly, with expressions Dan didn't fully understand, but whose meaning he for me. He ate. The pier grew. The carpenter knew his craft. By the end of the 3rd week, a 12-meter-long wooden platform stretched from the shore into the bay. Rough, without railings, but sturdy. The first schooner moored to it and didn't get a scratch. A small victory. Huge by local standards. By the end of the first month, 11 people were living on Karan permanently. Hinari, the carpenter, 2 smokehouse workers, the net mender, and 6 fishermen who decided that Dan's forecasts were worth living on the windswept rock. Dan gave them morning briefings. Every day, simple and brief. Wind from there, force such and such, fish there, danger there. The fishermen left at dawn. They returned around noon. The catch was good, better than in their former ports, because they went where the fish were, not where luck might take them. 2 of them had lost their families to starvation during the last year of the dead season. They didn't talk about it, but Dan saw how they looked at the full nets, with an expression that was more than joy. It was disbelief, that it was possible to fish without fear. Dan began to systematize the flash code. 8 words weren't enough. He added 12 more, numbers from 1 to 10, the words left and right, the hours, speed. Now he could send a simple message with the signal. Storm, north, 6 o'clock, force 7. Any ship within sight of the lighthouse could receive the warning. The problem was that no one but Dan knew the code. He taught Hinari first. She learned it in 2 days. Not because she was smart. She was smart. But most importantly, she was patient. She sat on the upper platform next to Dan and repeated the combinations until her fingers started to hurt. Then Dan would stand on the shore while Hinari flashed the signals from the tower, and he would check if she was transmitting them correctly. There were mistakes, a lot at first, then fewer. After a week, Hinari could transmit a simple warning without error. Dan wrote it down in the log. First operator besides me, Hinari Hyun. Transmission accuracy 94%. Acceptable. But there was one he couldn't teach her, to read the map. The crystal only responded to him. Hinari touched it and nothing happened. The stone remained dark, warm but dark. Dan tried different variations, his hand on the crystal at the same time as her hand. It didn't work. The crystal glowed for him and only for him. That was a limitation, a serious one. If Dan is sick or wounded or simply asleep, the map doesn't work. No one else can read the data. The entire system depends on a single person. Dan noted in the log, critical vulnerability, single point of failure, me. At the end of the first month, a visitor of a different kind arrived. Not a fisherman, not a captain. A skiff with one man, well-dressed, clean hands, and expensive raincoat, a silver clasp on the collar. He called himself Thorn, a representative of interests in the region. He didn't specify whose. He asked to go up the lighthouse. Dan let him. Thorn looked at the chart. He was silent. Then he asked questions, calm, precise. How many ships come in a week? What forecasts Dan gives? How far the chart extends? Dan answered all the questions honestly. He had no reason to lie. Yet. Thorn thanked him, said he was impressed. Left. Hinari stood on the pier and watched the boat sail away. When Dan came down, she said the clasp on Thorn's cloak had a crest, a drop of water in a silver circle. The of the House of the Elder Water. Dan asked what it meant. Hinari explained. 5 trading houses. They keep the peace, control the routes, trade information about the weather and currents. They charge money for this, big money. The House of the Elder Water is the strongest in the north. If they're interested in Karen, it could be good. Or very bad, Dan thought. He returned to the tower. He wrote it down in the log. First contact with a trading house, the House of Elder Water. They sent a scout, assessing the situation, expected response. Offer, then pressure, then a threat. Standard escalation for a monopoly facing a competitor. He wrote it in the same words he would have used in a report to NOAA. Dry, to the point, without emotion. Then he closed the logbook and looked out the window. Clouds were gathering on the horizon. The map showed a new front. In 2 days. Not strong. But Dan noted it down too. Every front, every change, every day. The data piled up. And every new day of data made the next forecast more accurate. Hinari Hyun stayed on Karen and became Dan's first assistant. She widened the entrance to the bay and learned the signal code. A permanent population of 11 people appeared on the island, including fishermen receiving daily forecasts. The House of the Elder Waters sent a scout named Thorn, and Dan noted in his log the beginning of a potential conflict. Toward the end of the second month, Dan discovered a pattern that changed everything. He sat poring over his logbook at night. Hinari slept downstairs at the base of the tower, in a shed the carpenter had pieced together from scraps of planks and canvas. Dan flipped through the pages. 61 days of observations. Pressure, temperature, fronts, currents, biosignatures. He plotted the data into tables on separate sheets. Out of habit, just as he had done at NOAA when searching for patterns in Alaska's seasonal storms. And he saw it. The Leviathans surfaced before the cyclones. Not during, not after, before. 18 to 24 hours before the low-pressure system reached its critical point, large biosignatures rose closer to the surface. Every time. In 17 out of 21 recorded cases. An 81% correlation. Dan pored over these numbers and realized he held the key in his hands. The Leviathans sense the drop in pressure, before it shows up on the map, before even the most accurate forecast. They're like living barometers. If you track their movements, you can get a warning a day earlier than the map itself provides, and the map already gives 2 or 3 days notice. So, taking the Leviathans into account, the forecasting horizon extends to 3 or 4 days. For a world where the best pilots predict the weather half a day in advance, this is like seeing the future. Dan wrote down this discovery. He underlined it. For the first time in 2 months, he had underlined something in his journal. He didn't know that in 6 months' time, this fact would save 100,000 people in the kingdom of Ilum, but he knew it was important. In the morning, he told Hinari about it. She listened, sitting on the tower steps with a bowl of porridge on her lap. Then she said that the fishermen had always known. If you see a Leviathan on the surface, expect a storm. An old superstition. Dan paused. He asked why no one used it. Hinari shredded her shoulders. Because it's a superstition. That's what the old folks say. The young ones don't listen. And because seeing a Leviathan from the deck means seeing it 100 meters away. But on Dan's map, it's visible 50 miles out. The difference between knowledge and data. Dan nodded. That was exactly he'd been thinking. The knowledge had existed for 1,000 years. But without a system for collecting and analyzing it, it remained superstition. The second month brought something else. People. It wasn't just fishermen coming to Karen anymore. A family of 4 in a small boat, hungry, from the southern province where the fish had disappeared and the crops had been flooded. A man, a woman, 2 children. Dan watched them from the upper deck. They stood on the pier and waited. They didn't know who to turn to. They didn't know if they could stay here. Hinare went down. She took them to the smokehouse. She fed them. Then she went up to Dan and said they needed to make a decision. If Karen was taking in refugees, they needed rules. Who could stay? What they had to do? How to pay? Dan thought about it for 2 days. Then he wrote 3 lines on a piece of paper. Everyone who comes to Karen receives food and water for 3 days free of charge. After 3 days, a choice. Work on the island and receive a share of the total income. Or leave, having received a free forecast for the week ahead. No one is forced out. No one is held here by force. Hinari read it. She said it was too lenient. Slackers will come. Dan replied that he'd spot the slackers on the map. Those who don't work, don't stay. The biosignature is on site. Hinari looked at him. Then she laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, through clenched teeth, briefly, but sincerely. The family stayed. The man turned out to be a carpenter, a good one, better than the previous one. Over the next week, he reinforced the dock, so Hinari said she was ashamed of her previous work. The woman knew how to sew. She began mending sails for the fishermen. The children carried water from the spring. Little legs trudged up and down the rocky path 10 times a day. Karen was growing. By the end of the second month, there were 23 people here. By the start of the third, 30. Fishermen, carpenters, families, single women with children, old people with nowhere else to go. Dan gave the morning forecasts. The fishermen left. They returned with fish. The smokehouse workers were busy. The carpenter built. The net maker wove nets. A system. Simple. Rough. But it worked. Dan wasn't a leader. He didn't give orders. He didn't decide who would do what. He simply provided information. And the people decided for themselves. Hinare managed the shore. Dan managed the data. One evening she went upstairs later than usual. Dan was sitting at the table. The map was flickering. Hinare stood beside him. She was silent. Then she said the fishermen were asking who he was. Not his name. They knew his name. Who he was. How he knew what he knew. Why the crystal glowed for him. Dan was silent. He couldn't tell the truth. That he was from another world. That he had died on a ferry in Seattle. That he'd spent 7 years sitting in front of monitors, reading data from buoys. That wouldn't make any sense. He said he just knew how to calculate. Not predict. Calculate. There's a difference. A predictor says what will happen. A counter says what is most likely to happen, based on what is there. He makes mistakes. Not often, but he makes mistakes. And when he makes a mistake, he records it so he'll make fewer mistakes next time. Hinare listened. Then she said that was a good answer. Better than if he'd said he was a prophet. People believe prophets, and then hate them when they're wrong. A counter is simply allowed to count. Dan looked at her. She understood everything. Maybe not everything, but she understood the main thing. In the 3rd month, a second guest arrived from House of the Elder Water arrived. Not Thorn, another one, a woman, tall, in a black cloak, with 2 guards. She didn't ask to go up to the lighthouse. She surveyed the pier, counted the boats in the cove, spoke with the fishermen. They answered evasively. Hinare had taught them. The woman left without saying a word to Dan, but one of the guards lingered on the shore. He looked at the tower, at the light of the crystal, and Dan saw him calculating. The height of the tower, the width of the windows, the thickness of the walls. A military assessment. Dan wrote in his log, 2nd visit, reconnaissance, military element, assessment of fortifications, 2nd stage. A proposal was coming soon. He was right. 2 weeks later, a ship arrived. Not a schooner, a merchant brig, a large one, with the crest of the House of Elder Water on its sail. A drop of water in a silver circle. A man in fine clothes stepped off the ship. He introduced himself as an advisor to the head of the house. He brought a proposal about a partnership. The House of the Elder Water would take Karen under its protection, provide supplies, building materials, people. In return, Dan would share his forecasts exclusively with the house. No one else. A monopoly on information, as always. Dan listened, asked for a day to think it over. The advisor agreed. He stayed on the brig in the cove. At night, Dan sat at the table. The map flickered. He thought. The offer made sense. The House of the Elder Water could give Karen everything he needed: protection, resources, connections, in exchange for one thing: silence. Dan would speak only to them, and they would sell his words to the world, just as they had sold the words of bribed priests and corrupt pilots until now. Only now they would have the real thing, not a lie, but the truth. And that would be worse than a lie, because the truth, held in the hands of a single man, cannot be disputed. Dan went down in the morning. He met the advisor at the pier. He said no, politely, with the journal in his hands. He explained that Karen's prophecies were open to anyone who wanted them. They were not a matter for bargaining. The advisor smiled, subtly. He said that the head of the house of Sergen Almar would be disappointed, and that Sergen Almar's disappointment was not something any sensible person would want. Dan replied that he would pass on his apologies. Bree left. Hinari stood next to Dan on the pier and said nothing. Then she said that he had just quarreled with the most dangerous man in the northern seas. Dan nodded. He wrote it down in the log. Proposal rejected. Expected reaction. Escalation. Timeline. 3 to 6 months until direct pressure. Dan discovered that the Leviathans surface a day before cyclones, which extends the forecast horizon to 4 days. Quran's population had grown to 30 people, and the island began to function as a simple settlement. The House of the Elder Water sent an official proposal for an exclusive partnership, and Dan refused, thereby provoking a direct conflict with Sergen Almar. In the 4th month, a woman washed ashore on Quran who changed everything about the training. Sonva Cho arrived at night, alone, in a boat without a sail, with a single oar. Her face was gray with salt and fatigue, a scar across her left eyebrow, gray strands in her black hair. She was 31 years old, but she looked 40. Hinari found her in the morning on the rocks by the cove. The boat had crashed into a reef that wasn't marked on the old maps. Sonhua lay on the rocks and breathed. She just breathed. She didn't ask for help. She didn't call out. She lay there and breathed. Hinare took her to the smokehouse, gave her food, water, a blanket. Sonhua ate everything in silence. Then she asked where the caretaker was. Hinare took her upstairs. Dan was standing at the table. Sonhua entered. She stopped. She looked at the map, at the glowing lines, at the isobaths, fronts, and black dots. She was silent for a long time. Dan saw how she was looking, not like a fisherman, not like a captain, like a person who understands what she sees. Sonhua said she was a pilot. She had been a pilot. House of the Elder Waters. For 10 years she had led caravans along the northern routes. She knew the currents, the winds, and the habits of the Leviathans. She knew the maps that the house kept secret, routes that were valued more than gold. Dan asked why she was here. Sonhua paused. Then she told him. A year ago, the house had ordered her to lead a caravan through the Keno Strait. She knew the strait was dangerous. The currents shifted unpredictably. Leviathans nested at the southern entrance. But the house wanted the caravan to pass. Not their caravan, a rival's caravan, Dumkyung. Sonhua was supposed to lead their caravan through the strait and abandon them halfway, sail away in her own boat and leave the caravan trapped. The currents and the Leviathans would do the rest. 12 ships, 400 people. Sonhua refused. Dom did not forgive her. She was stripped of her rank, her boat was taken away, her property. Her name was struck from the register of pilots. For a sailor in this world, that is worse than death. At least the dead are remembered. Those who are erased, no. She wandered through port cities for 2 months. She worked for food. Then she heard about Quran, about the lighthouse that tells the truth, about the keeper who doesn't trade in predictions. She stole a boat, set out to sea, made it here. Dan listened in silence. Then he asked what she could do. Sonhua answered briefly. Guide ships, feel the water, to teach people. Dan nodded. He said he needed a third skill. To teach. The signal code, 20 combinations. People must be able to receive and transmit the lighthouse signals. And not just one person, not 2. Dozens, hundreds. Dan can predict the weather, but so far, only Hinari can transmit his signal. And Hinari is alone. A system is needed. Signalers are needed on every ship working with Karen. Repeaters are needed on neighboring islands. A network is needed. Sonva listened. Her expression changed. Something lit up in it. Not joy, not gratitude, something like hunger. For 10 years, she had worked for a system that killed people with information, hid data, distorted maps, sold lies disguised as truth. And now here stood a man offering her the chance to create the exact opposite, a system that spreads the truth. Sonva said one word. Yes. She started that very day, gathered 6 fishermen on the shore, explained the code to them. Not the way Dan explained it. Dan explained the logic. why a short flash is a dot, why a long one is a dash. Sonva didn't explain why. She made them repeat it, over and over, until their fingers remembered it better than their heads. The house of the Elder Waters Military School for Pilots. Cruel. Effective. Dan watched from above. In a week, the 6 fishermen could receive a simple message. Storm, north, 6 o'clock. In 2 weeks, they could send a reply. Got it. Coming. Gone. Sunhwa was a ruthless teacher, but fair. Got it wrong. Repeat. Got it wrong again. Repeat some more. No shouting, no humiliation, just repetition, until it became second nature. Hinari and Sunhwa didn't get along right away. Hinari was loud and straightforward. Sunhwa was quiet and cold. Hinari ran the shore through relationships. She called everyone by name. She knew who had a sore back and who had quarreled with his wife. Sunhwa managed training through discipline. She didn't care what your name was. What mattered to her was whether you could send a signal in a storm when your hands were wet and the boat was rocking. They clashed in the second week. Hinari said that Sunhwa was being too harsh on an old fisherman in his 60s. Sunhwa replied that the storm didn't care how old he was, and if he couldn't handle the signal, he shouldn't go out to sea. Hinari flared up. Sunhwa didn't flinch. Dan found out about it that evening, when Hinari brought him dinner and slammed the bowl down on the table so hard that porridge spilled onto the magazine. Dan wiped the page clean. He asked what had happened. Hinari told him. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said that they were both right. Sunhwa was right that the signal had to work under any conditions. Hinari was right that people shouldn't be broken. The solution? 2 levels of training. Basic for everyone. Receiving simple signals. Anyone can learn that. Advanced for those who go out to sea. Transmission in difficult conditions. That's for those who can and want to. Hinari listened. She said that Dan had decided everything again, sitting up there and not seeing the people. Dan replied that he sees the people, on the map, every day. He sees where they sail and where they return from, and who stays out at sea longer than they should because they're afraid to come back with empty nets. Hinari fell silent. Then she took a bowl and left. But the next day she relayed Dan's words to Sunhwa. 2 levels. Sunhwa nodded. She restructured the training. Basic course, 3 days. Advanced, 2 weeks. The old fishermen stayed in the basic course. The 4 young men went to the advanced course. The system worked. The 5th month brought changes that Dan hadn't foreseen on any map. Karan's population had grown to 50 people. The pier was doubled in size. A second structure appeared on the shore. Not just a shed, but a real house. Stone walls. A roof made of wood and canvas. Inside, a table, benches, a hearth. Hinari called it a tavern. Dan called it a gathering place. Hinari looked at him and said that tavern sounded better. The tavern became the center of life on the shore. Fishermen came in the morning to get the forecast. Dan relayed the data through Hinari or one of the trained signalers. In the evening, the fishermen returned to the tavern. They ate, they talked, they discussed the sea. Dan didn't come down. Almost never. The tower demanded his presence. The crystal only worked when he was nearby. If he left for even a day, the map went dark. The data stopped coming in. Forecasts weren't made. He was tied down, not by a chain, not by an order, by necessity. If he left, people would lose the only thing that gave them an advantage over the sea: information. Sometimes at night he stood by the window and looked at the lights below. The tavern glowed. People moved about, laughed, lived, and he stood up there like a cog in a machine, necessary, irreplaceable, and lonely. Hinari came up to him every evening. She brought him food. She told him what was happening down below, who had quarreled with whom, who had made up, whose child had caught a fish for the first time. She was his connection to the outside world, literally. Without her, he would know about life on the island only from dots on a map. One evening she came later than usual. Dan had already gone to bed. He wasn't asleep, but he was lying down. Hinari set down a bowl. She looked at him. Then she sat down next to him by the wall. She said there had been a storm in the west today, far away, but she'd seen how nervous the fishermen were. Every storm, even a distant one, reminded them of the ones that had taken their families, their homes, their former lives. Dan listened. Hinari spoke quietly, not to him, more to the void. She said she had been the captain's daughter her whole life, not Hinari, Hyung's daughter. Everything she knew, she had learned from her father. Everything she knew, she had learned from her father. And then she arrived on the Quran, and for the first time, someone asked her not about what her father had told her, but about what she had seen herself, what she felt when the boat heeled, how she read the waves herself. Dan asked for her details, not her father's, hers. And it was the first time in her life that someone had told her that her experience had value. Not because she was Hyung's daughter, but because she was Hinari. She fell silent. Dan didn't know what to say. He wasn't good at conversations like this. Ever. Not even in Seattle. Marcus had told him that he interacted with people like he did with buoys. He sent a signal and waited for a response. Dan said the only thing that came to mind. He said that the data on the Lucina's behavior during the storm had allowed him to adjust the model of the lateral roll for schooners of this class by 14%, and that this would save someone's life. Or maybe it already had. Hinari looked at him. Then she laughed. Quietly, through clenched teeth. She said he was hopeless. But that 14% was a good figure. She didn't leave that night. She stayed to sleep on the upper deck, on the floor, next to him, without touching him, just next to him. In the morning, she got up before him. When he woke up, there was a bowl of porridge by his hand, and Hinari was already heading down the stairs, shouting to someone below that the boat had been tied up wrong. Dan made an entry in the log. Day 143, pressure stable, no fronts, Leviathans in the south, no changes. Population, 52 people. Trained signalmen, 11. 23 people have completed the basic course. And after a pause, he added a single line. Hinari stayed. Sunhwa Cho, former pilot of the House of Star of Water, arrived on Quran and took on the task of training signalers, creating a two-tiered training system. The island's population grew to 52 people, and a tavern appeared, becoming the center of social life. The relationship between Dan and Hinari shifted from professional to personal, and Hinari stayed overnight in the tower for the first time. In the 6th month, Dan introduced a fee: 3 copper coins for a daily forecast, a silver coin for a weekly one. The decision was a difficult one. Hinari had been talking about it for 2 weeks. Carran was already feeding 80 people. Fish and mussels are food, but not a livelihood. We need flour. We need salt for preserves. We need tools, nails, cloth, medicine. All of this costs money, and the only money on Carran was what the captains brought in exchange for forecasts. And they brought little because the forecasts were free. Dan sat over his ledger and calculated. Expenses were growing faster than income. In 2 months, Carran would start starving. Not because there was little fish, but because you can't buy iron with fish. Hinari said they needed to charge a fee. Sonva agreed. Dan resisted. He remembered NOAA. Storm warnings are free. For everyone. Always. That's the principle. Weather cannot be a commodity. Hinari sat down next to him on the upper deck and said calmly that he wasn't at NOAA, that there was no government here paying his salary, no taxes to maintain the stations, no budget. There was him. There was the tower. There were 80 mouths to feed, and if he wants those mouths not to go hungry in the winter, he has to charge those who can pay, so that those who can't would get the forecast for free. Dan thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th, he wrote down the rules. A daily forecast for Quran fishermen is free. A daily forecast for visiting captains is 3 copper coins. A weekly forecast is 1 silver coin. A personalized route calculation, taking into account the draft and vessel type, is 3 silver coins. Storm warnings are free, always, for everyone, no exceptions. He underlined the last point twice. The captains grumbled, for the first week, then they did the math. Dan's weekly forecast cost a silver coin. Cargo lost in a storm cost 10 gold coins. A broken mast cost 5 gold coins. A drowned sailor was priceless, but his family received 2 gold coins in compensation. A silver coin for a week of calm seas. It doesn't get any cheaper than that. By the end of the first week, Dan had earned 14 silver coins. By the end of the 2nd month, a blacksmith had appeared on the island. Not a real blacksmith. A wandering craftsman who repaired anchors and forged hooks. But he had a forge, and hands that knew how to work with metal. Iron was to Quran what blood is to the body. Without it, nothing is built. Nothing is repaired. Nothing holds together. The money from the forecasts went to work. Flour from the port of Elam, salt from the southern islands, planks from the western forest provinces. Quran ceased to be a rock for people. He began to become a place. In the 7th month, Eri Moon arrived. Dan didn't notice her right away. She had sailed in with a group of refugees from the province of Talgyon. 12 people in a boat meant for 6. Half were sick. 2 were dying. Eri was among them. 19 years old, skinny to the point of transparency, huge eyes on a small face, her younger brother in her arms. The boy was 6. He didn't speak, not because he couldn't, because he had stopped. Hinari took in the refugees. She put them up in the tavern. She fed them. The sick were laid on benches. Eri wouldn't let go of her brother. Even when they brought her a bowl of porridge, she ate with one hand and held the boy with the other. Dan found out about her a week later, not from Hinari, from Sonwa. Sonwa came upstairs with an expression on her face that Dan had never seen on her before, something like surprise. She said there was a girl among the refugees, quiet, taciturn. She helps in the smokehouse, carries water, doesn't complain. And she has a special talent. She remembers everything. Sonwa was conducting the morning briefing for the signalmen. Eri sat nearby. She didn't participate. She just listened. After the briefing, Sonwa casually asked who remembered the sequence of signals from yesterday's session. The fisherman hesitated. Eri quietly listed all 20 combinations, without a single mistake, in the correct order. Sonwa asked her to repeat the forecast for the past week. Eri repeated them, the numbers, the directions, times, wind speeds, everything Dan had relayed through the signalers every morning for 7 days, without a single mistake. Dan came down. For the first time in a long while, he came down not out of necessity, but out of interest. He found Eri by the smokehouse. She was sitting on a rock. Her brother was playing with seashells nearby. Dan sat down across from her. He asked if she remembered his notes. Eri looked at him, not fearfully, not warily, just intently. She said yes. She had seen his journal once. Hinari had shown it to the tavern. The pages were open, data from the last month. Dan asked if she could repeat it. Eri began to speak, in a quiet, steady voice. Day 91. Pressure is dropping in the northwest. A front from the south. Water temperature, current, biosignatures. 2 objects in the southeast, 1 stationary. Day 92. Pressure stable. The front has passed. Water temperature rose by 2 degrees. She spoke for 3 minutes. Dan listened. Every number matched. Every direction. Every day. 30 days of data from a single log review. Dan returned to the tower. He took out the log. He checked it. Eri had made 2 mistakes. Once she mixed up the direction of the current. The second time she rounded the temperature. 2 errors out of 3,000 data points. Dan sat down and stared at the numbers for a long time. Then he wrote in the logbook. Human resource of critical value discovered. Eri Moon. Eidetic or near-eidetic memory for numerical data. 99.93% accuracy with a single visual contact. Recommendation. Immediate inclusion in the archiving system. The next day he offered Eri a job. Not fish, not water, not the smokehouse. The log. She would record data, every day, every observation. She would duplicate his entries, check them, look for errors. Because Dan made mistakes, rarely, but he did make. And Eri almost never made mistakes. Eri was silent. Then she asked quietly, "What will happen to my brother?" Dan said there would be a room for her brother, in the tower, a small one, with a table just her height, with a shelf for the boy. Eri looked at him. Her eyes were shining. She didn't understand why he was doing this, why she needed a separate room, why a table just her height. She was used to being nobody, a mouth that needed to be fed, hands that had to work, not a person who had a room. Dan said it simply. He said that without her, he would lose the data. That memory was unreliable. His memory. Paper burns, ink fades. But if Eri remembers everything, then she is a living archive. She is not an assistant. She is an archive. Eri began to cry. Quietly, silently. Tears ran down her cheeks, but her face didn't move. She didn't understand why she was crying. Dan didn't understand either, but he knew he had spoken the truth. She was needed, truly. Not out of pity, out of necessity, and that was better than pity. A week later, Eri sat in the tower at a stone table, transcribing the journal. The boy was playing on the shelf with wooden figurines that one of the fishermen had carved. The crystal shimmered. The map glowed. Eri worked in silence, quickly, neatly. Her handwriting was small and even, better than Dan's. By the end of the first week, she had noticed 3 discrepancies in his notes. The data for one day didn't match the previous or the following day. Eri pointed it out. Dan checked the map. She was right. He had made a mistake. He had entered the wrong current direction. He had copied it from the previous day out of habit. 3 days, 3 errors. Imperceptible. But in a long data series, they would distort the trend. Eri found them in a day. Dan noted it down. The data quality control system is working. Operator Eri Moon. 0 false positives, 0 missed errors. Recommendation: full access to all records. The 8th month was the first truly difficult one. The dead season had entered its 3rd winter. Storms came one after another. A week of calm, then 3 storms in a row. then calm again. The map showed chaos. Fronts collided, they shifted, they vanished and reappeared. Dan pored over the data at night. He looked for a pattern. He couldn't find one. It was like an El Niño season, only worse. The system was changing, not day by day, but year by year. Something global, something he hadn't seen from a single lighthouse before. The fishermen were afraid to go out, even with forecasts, even with warnings. 3 storms in a row isn't just weather, it's a punishment. That's what they said in the tavern. Dan heard it through Hinari. She brought not only food, but also the mood. And the mood was bad. Mina So arrived in the midst of the 3rd storm. A small boat, a white temple flag on the mast. Any other captain would have turned back. Mina entered Karen Bay into a wall of rain and wind at the lighthouse's signal. She knew the code. Not from Sonhwa, not from the fishermen. She had learned it herself. Overheard it in the harbor temple, where sailors discussed strange flashes from Karen. Memorized it. Figured it out. Mina was a priestess at a small seaside temple on the island of Kemen. 22 years old, slender, pale, a white bandage on her forehead. She spoke in formulas from sacred texts, but her eyes were alive, quick, calculating. The temple had sent her to investigate. The priests on Kemen had heard of Karen, of the keeper who foretells storms. For the temple, it was either a miracle or heresy. Both required investigation. Mina climbed up to the tower, wet, frozen. Dan gave her a blanket, showed her a map. Mina looked at the glowing lines and remained silent longer than anyone before her. Then she said that the sacred texts described something similar. The voice of the sea, ancient watchers who heard the water and spoke with it. The temple considered it a metaphor, maybe not a metaphor. Dan said he didn't hear the water. He read the pressure. Mina replied that for a fisherman on a boat, it made no difference. It didn't matter to him whether you heard the water or read the pressure. Only one thing mattered to him, whether he would return home or not, Dan thought. Then he asked if Mina could explain his forecasts to people who don't understand pressure and fronts, to people who understand only the will of the sea and the wrath of the heavens. Mina looked at him. She said that was her job, to translate, from the language of the gods into the language of humans. Only before, she translated emptiness, words without meaning, rituals without purpose. But now she has something to translate. She stayed. She became Karen's face to the faithful. When the fishermen were afraid to go out after 3 storms in a row, Mina went down to the shore and spoke with them. Not in Dan's language, not in percentages and directions. She said that the sea is not angry. The sea breathes. Breathing has a rhythm. The watchman sees this rhythm, and when he says that tomorrow will be calm, it means the sea has exhaled. It's safe to go out. The fishermen listened. They were used to listening to priestesses. It was familiar, understandable. But unlike the priestesses of the past, Mina's words were proven true. Tomorrow really was calm. The sea really had exhaled. And the fishermen went out, and they returned. Dan watched this from above. He recorded it in the log. The communication problem has been solved. Technical data is transmitted through a religious framework. The efficiency of information delivery has increased by approximately 40%. Operator Mina So. Position: translator. Hinari read this entry and said that Dan was an impossible person. Dan asked why. Hinari said that a normal person would have written that the priestess helps people not to be afraid, but he wrote efficiency of information delivery. Dan thought about it. He said it was the same thing. Hinari shook her head, but she smiled. By the end of the 5th month, Ashley Raven flew into Karen Bay like a cannonball into a wall. Fast, loud, with a crash. Her ship was called the Silver Seagull, a small merchant vessel. Fast, with a shallow draft and gaff sails that allowed it to sail closer to the wind than any schooner in northern waters. Ashley didn't ask for permission to enter the bay. She saw the lighthouse signal, read the code, entered. Dropped anchor 20 meters from the pier. She jumped into a rowboat and rowed to shore standing up. Red hair, freckles, a broad smile. She climbed onto the pier and the first thing she asked was where she could buy fresh water and sell a barrel of southern wine. Hinari stood on the pier and looked at her with an expression that Dan later described in his journal as the initial phase of a territorial conflict. Ashley was from a merchant family on the mainland, the youngest of 6 children. 5 older brothers. Each got a ship, a route, a share in the family business. Ashley got nothing. Her father said a girl had no place at the helm. Ashley replied that then she would stand her ground. She bought the Silver Seagull with her last pennies. She set sail. For 3 years, she traded on her own. between ports, between the islands, between the storms. She was fast, brave, and angry at the whole world that told her she couldn't. She climbed into the tower uninvited. Dan was standing at the table. Ashley walked in. She looked at the map. She whistled. Then she looked at Dan. She said she'd heard about him in the port of Eye, at Calmo Harbor, at West Point Harbor. Same story everywhere. A madman in a lighthouse who predicts storms. She'd sailed in to check it out. Dan asked what she wanted. Ashley said she wanted a week-long forecast for the southwest. She was carrying cargo to the port of Maiden. 3 days' journey with a fair wind, 4 with a bad one, a week if there's a storm. Dan looked at the map. He did the math. Southwest direction. No fronts for the next 4 days. Fair winds, 7 to 9 knots. 1 Leviathan on the route, far off course. But in 5 days, a cyclone will come from the west. A serious one. She should be in Maiden in 4 days or return to Karan, not get stuck in the middle. Dan said all this. He added that her ship had a shallow draft. He'd seen the draft when she entered the bay. That meant she could pass through the shallows near Recco Island. Ordinary merchant ships round Recco from the east. It's a half-day detour. But the Silver Seagull will go straight through. She'll save 6 hours. That'll be enough. Ashley listened. Her eyes sparkled. Then she laughed. Loudly. She said that either Dan was a genius or the best con artist in the northern seas, but that she'd take the risk. She asked the price. Dan said a silver coin for the weekly route, 3 for a custom route. Ashley laid down 4. She said the extra was for entertainment. She left. She returned 8 days later. Just as Dan had predicted, the cyclone hit on the 5th day. Ashley was already in Midden. She sold the wine. She bought fabric. She weathered the storm. She sailed out through the window Dan had given her. She returned to Karan with a full hold and a smile that made Hinari's eye twitch. Ashley stayed, not because she'd fallen in love, not because she needed protection, because it was interesting here. Here was a man who told her where to sail and was always right. Here were routes that no one else knew. Here was the chance to trade faster and safer than any of her brothers. She became Karan's first independent captain. She hauled cargo between the islands. She scouted new routes. She brought news from the ports. And she argued with Sonva every time she said Ashley's route was too risky. Sonva said that often. Ashley was one of those captains who walked the line. Shallow waters, narrow straits, close to shore, where it's faster but more dangerous. Sonva had spent 10 years teaching people to avoid such places. Their conflict was professional, deep, honest. Sonva believed that safety came before speed. Ashley believed that speed was safety because the less time at sea, the less chance of getting into trouble. Both were right. Both were wrong. Dan didn't interfere. He provided the data. They decided for themselves. But he noted in his log that the existence of 2 opposing approaches to navigation made the system more stable. One strategy is vulnerability. The other is choice. By the 10th month, nearly 80 people were living on Karan. A blacksmith shop had appeared, a real one, not a traveling smith with a portable forge, but a permanent workshop with an anvil and bellows. The blacksmith was Tara Lind. She had arrived with a group of artisans hired by Hyunggu at the port of Ilam. Tall, silent, her forearms marked by old burns, a habit of tapping her fingers on any metal that came to hand. Tara asked no questions. She did not go up to the tower. She wasn't interested in the map. She looked at what had been built on Karan and said the pier wouldn't survive the winter. The wood was weak. The joints were poor. Iron clamps were needed. Bolts were needed. Hinges were needed. She set up the forge on the 2nd day. By the 3rd, she was already forging. Dan watched her from the upper platform. A small figure by the fire. Sparks, a clang, rhythmic, steady, like a metronome. Tara was a widow. Her husband had been a blacksmith. He died 2 years ago. A cave-in in the mine where he bought ore. Tara didn't talk about it. Dan found out from Hinari. Hinari knew everything about everyone. That was her quality. She gathered people the way Dan gathered data. Naturally, without effort. Tara worked. Every day, from dawn till dusk. Staples for the pier, hooks for fishermen, hinges for doors, window frames, tool tips. Iron brought life to everything it touched. The pier grew stronger, houses more reliable, boats sturdier. Dan went down to the smithy 4 weeks after Tara's arrival. He wanted to discuss an idea with her. There was only one crystal in the tower, but Dan had discovered tiny shards around its base. Tiny, the size of a fingernail. They lay in the gap between the frame and the stone of the table. Dan picked one up, placed it in his palm. The shard shimmered, faintly, barely noticeable, but it shimmered. He held the shard up to the window. The shimmer grew stronger. He carried it down the stairs. On the 20th step, the shimmer vanished. He went back upstairs. The shimmer returned. The shard was reacting to the crystal. From a distance, like a repeater. The idea was simple. If he inserted the shard into an iron frame and raised it high, maybe it would shimmer from a greater distance. And if someone on a neighboring island saw the flicker, they would understand that the beacon was sending a signal. Not a full map, just a flash. Light, no light, a code. Tara listened. She tapped her fingers on the anvil. Then she said she could make a frame. Lightweight, sturdy, so it could be placed on a rock. But she needed to know the exact size of the shard, and how it reacted to metal. Maybe iron would block the signal. Maybe it would amplify it. They had to test it. Dan nodded. They started working together, in the evenings, after Tara finished her day's work. She would come to the base of the tower. Dan would come down with the shard. Tara would try different metals, different shapes. Iron didn't dampen it. Copper amplified it, slightly, but noticeably. Tara forged a copper frame, thin, elegant, with a holder for the shard. Dan inserted the shard. The glimmer grew brighter. They hoisted the frame onto the roof of the smokehouse, the highest point on the shore after the tower. The shard flickered. It was visible from the tower, from the sea too, a faint light, but visible. Dan returned to the tower. He covered the crystal with his palm, opened it, covered it, ran back down. He asked Tara if she could see it. Tara nodded. The shard on the roof was flashing repeatedly, with a 1-second delay, but it was repeating. The repeater was working. Dan stood on the shore and watched the small light on the roof of the smokehouse. The first repeater, the first step toward a network. If he set up another one on the neighboring island, and there was someone there who knew the code, the beacon could relay the signal further. Not 50 miles, 100, 200. Each repeater doubles the range. Dan wrote it down in the log. The repeater prototype works. Copper frame, a shard of crystal, 1-second signal delay. Range needs to be verified. Next step, installation at a remote location. Tara stood nearby. She was silent. Then she said her husband used to do similar things. Not with crystals, with metal. He figured out how to do it better, simpler, more precisely. She said that Dan reminded her of her husband. Not physically. Her husband had been a big, broad-shouldered man with a loud laugh. Dan was skinny and quiet. But in the way he worked, in the way he looked at a problem, he'd try things out, test them. He wouldn't rest until he found the right solution. Dan didn't know what to say. He said those were kind words. Tara nodded. She walked over to the forge. Dan stood on the shore. A small light on the roof flickered in time with the crystal above. Below, hammers clanged and the smell of smoke wafted from the smokehouse. Fishermen stood on the pier, mending their nets. The silver seagull rocked at anchor. From somewhere in the tavern came Ashley's laughter and Sonwa's indignant voice. Karen was alive. Ashley Raven arrived on Karen and became the island's first free captain, scouting trade routes. Blacksmith Tara Lynn supplied the island with iron, and together with Dan, created the first working relay station from a crystal shard in a copper frame. Karen's population reached 80 people, and a full-fledged infrastructure emerged on the island, including a blacksmith shop, a tavern, and an expanded pier. In the 11th month, someone tried to kill Dan. He saw the assassin 3 days later, on the map. A small red dot, a boat, coming from the southwest. One, unloaded. Dan knew what merchant ships looked like on the map. Heavy, warm, with a dense biosignature of cargo and people. Fishing boats are recognizable too. Light, with a characteristic movement pattern. Zigzags, stops, course changes. This boat was different. Light, empty, heading straight, no zigzags, no stopping, heading for Quran. A man in a boat without cargo who knows exactly where he's going. Dan made a note in the log. Unidentified vessel, empty, heading for Quran, not for trade, not for fishing, high probability of hostile intent. He called Sonwa. She pointed to a spot on the map. Sonwa looked at it for a minute. Then she uttered a single word. Blade. That was what the House of the Elder Water Fleet called the hired assassins they sent to their rivals. A small boat. One man. No cargo. No traces. The man lands at night, does his job, leaves, sinks the boat. No clues. Sonwa knew this because she'd seen it for 10 years. From the inside. Dan asked what to do. Sonwa said they needed to meet him, not hide, not to wait until he crept up at night. Meet him on the water. Show him they knew. A blade only works when it's not expected. Dan thought it over. The boat would be at Karan's in 2 days. He looked at the map, the weather, the currents, the wind, and he saw a better option. A light fog was rolling in from the south. Not a storm, fog, thick, low. In a day, it would cover the Karan area. Visibility would worsen. The killer's boat would enter the fog 6 hours before approaching the island. Dan knew where it was safe in the fog and where it wasn't. The killer didn't know that. Dan went down to Ashley. The Silver Seagull was moored at the dock. Ashley was sitting on the deck, mending a rope. Dan explained the situation, briefly, without emotion. A man was following him to kill him. They had to intercept him. Ashley listened. Then she stood up, stretched. She asked when they should set out. Dan said tomorrow at dawn. He would mark the route, through the fog. She would get through, but the killer won't. Ashley smiled. She said that finally something interesting had happened. Dan returned to the tower. He calculated the route. Shallow waters off the southern edge of Karan. There, the current in the fog creates a whirlpool, small but nasty. It'll spin a boat without a heavy load. It won't sink it, but it'll knock it off course. And the Silver Seagull, with its draft and keel, will pass along the edge. If Ashley is precise, if she follows the course to the minute. In the morning, Ashley left the house. The fog had settled, just as Dan had predicted. Thick, white. You couldn't see the water from the tower. Only a white, flat expanse stretching to the horizon, and the masts of the ships in the bay, sticking out like fingers from under a blanket. Dan was watching the chart. The Silver Seagull's dot was moving exactly along the route. Ashley listened to the lighthouse signals. Hinare relayed them. Left, straight ahead. 2 degrees to the right, straight ahead. The killer's dot entered the fog. It slowed down. It jerked. The current caught the light boat. It spun. The dot darted about. It lost its bearing. The Silver Seagull passed by at a distance of 100 meters. In the fog, the killer didn't notice it. But Ashley saw him. On the map. Dan relayed the coordinates. Ashley emerged from the fog on the windward side. The killer's boat was bobbing in the whirlpool. The man in it was trying to row. It was useless. The current was stronger. Ashley approached the boat alongside. 4 sailors jumped into the boat. They caught the killer quickly. He was a professional. A knife, a noose, poison in a ring, the full kit. But against 4 sailors with cutlasses, he couldn't do a thing. They brought him to Karan, bound, wet. Sonva interrogated him, quietly, professionally. Dan wasn't present. He didn't want to be. An hour later, Sandra went up to the tower. She said the killer had been sent by Sergen Almar, the head of the House of the Elder Water, personally. The contract was worth 20 gold pieces. The task was simple. Kill the keeper. Extinguish the lighthouse. Dan made a note in his journal. First assassination attempt. Client, Sergen Almar. The assassin was intercepted. Method of detection, map analysis. Method of interception, use of local conditions. No casualties. Then he set down his pen. He looked out the window. Someone wanted to kill him. For real. Not just in theory, not in the abstract. A living person had sailed across the sea for 3 days to plunge a knife into his throat. Because he gave people forecasts. Because he was getting in someone's way of doing business. Dan's hands began to tremble. He clenched them into fists. Hinari came in a minute later. She saw his face. She said nothing. She just stood beside him. She put her hand on his shoulder. She stood there until his hands stopped shaking. Then she said the soup was ready, and if he didn't come down, she'd pour it over his head. Dan came down. For the first time in a long while, I ate at the tavern, among people, fishermen, smokers, children. Tara by the far wall with a mug of tea. Ashley at the neighboring table next to him, recounting the story of the interception with great flourish and detail. Sonva ate her soup silently by the door. Ari in the corner with her brother. Mina on the floor by the hearth, reading something, her eyes closed and her lips moving silently. Dan sat among them. He ate soup, hot, salty, with fish and seaweed. He suddenly realized that for the first time, he wasn't eating alone. Not alone at the table. Not alone on the floor of the tower. Among people. Who knew his name. Who cared whether he lived or died. Who had sent Ashley into the fog so that he might survive. After the assassination attempt, Dan changed the security system. Not the walls, not the guards. The information. He expanded the surveillance radius. Every vessel entering the zone within 100 miles of Quran was now logged. Course, speed, type, cargo estimated by draft. ARI kept the registry. Each ship was assigned a number. Those that came regularly were marked as familiar. New ones were tracked until they became familiar or left. Sonva introduced a lookout watch. 2 people on shore, around the clock. Not military. Fishermen with a lantern and a whistle. But that was enough. Ashley began patrolling the nearby waters. Not for the sake of heroism, for the sake of trade. Safe waters around Quran, an argument for captains. Come to us. You won't be touched here. The House of the Elder Water was silent. After the failed assassination attempt, it was silent. That was worse than threats. Surgeon Almar's silence meant he was thinking. And when Surgeon Almar thought, he usually came up with something more terrifying than a direct strike. Dan understood that. He noted it in his log. A period of silence. The enemy is regrouping. Expected next move. Not a physical attack. Economic pressure or political isolation. The 12th month. A year. A whole year at the Lighthouse. Dan sat at the table at night. The crystal flickered. The map showed a calm sea. A rare occurrence in the dead season. He opened the logbook to the first page. Day 1. Low pressure in the northwest. Curved, wet letters scratched into the stone. He copied them onto paper. But he remembered. 365 days of data. 365 entries. ARI remembered them all. Dan remembered the main points. Patterns, trends, cycles. That's what he'd seen over the course of a year. The dead season isn't chaos. It's a shift, a global change in circulation. Warm currents from the south have shifted 3 degrees to the west. Cold currents from the north have accelerated. The collision zone, where storms form, had shifted. The old route charts were drawn up based on the zone's previous position. That's why the routes had become dangerous. Not because the sea had grown fiercer, but because the sea had changed, and people were sailing the old routes. Dan saw new lines, new routes, safe corridors that had opened up where there had been none before, and dangerous zones that had appeared where it used to be calm. He needed more data for confirmation. He needed more observation points. A single lighthouse sees far, but not everything. He needed a network. He made a note, year 1. And there, preliminary model of global circulation. Data from other points is required for confirmation. The observation network must be expanded. At least 3 repeaters on remote islands. Optimally, 7. Based on the number of old lighthouses. He finished the last line and closed the logbook. Outside the window, the masts of 23 ships bobbed in the bay. A year ago, there was nothing here. Dan had spotted the assassin's boat on the map, the one sent by Sergeant Almar 3 days before his arrival, and, with Ashley's help, had intercepted him in the fog using his knowledge of local currents. After the assassination attempt, a surveillance system was established to monitor all vessels within a 100-mile radius. By the end of the first year, Dan had determined that the dead season was caused by a global shift in circulation, and that a network of multiple observation points was needed to confirm the model. In the 13th month, Dan saw a storm that was not heading for Quran. It was heading for Ilam, the kingdom of Ilam, 100,000 people on the coast, fishing villages, a port, shipyards, a city. Dan spotted it 4 days later. The Leviathans sent the first signal. 3 large biosignature objects simultaneously rose to the surface in an area southwest of Ilam. 18 hours later, the isobars began to contract. A low-pressure system was forming rapidly, too quickly. Dan sat over the map and calculated. Pressure gradient, front speed, water temperature in the cyclone's path, warm. That was fuel. The cyclone would gain strength as long as it moved over warm water, and the warm water stretched all the way to the coast of Ilam. Dan calculated the force of the impact, 4 days, plus or minus 6 hours, force 9 to 10 on the scale, maybe even more. A storm surge of 3 to 4 meters. For the coastal villages, it's the end. For the port, a serious blow. For the ships in the harbor, it meant certain destruction. He sat poring over these figures and felt that familiar chill in his stomach. He had felt the same way in the control room of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration when data from the buoys showed that a storm was bearing down on the fleet. Only then did he press the button, and the warning was broadcast on all frequencies. Radio, satellite, automatic buoys. Within a minute, 1,000 ships knew. Here he had a crystal, a flashing light. Range, 50 miles. Ilum was 300 miles to the southwest, far beyond the reach of any signal. Dan called everyone: Hinari, Songwoo, Ashley, Daru, Eddie, Minu. They gathered in the tower, 6 women and him. Dan showed them the map. He explained: the storm, Elam, 4 days, 9 to 10 on the Beaufort scale, 100,000 people. Silence. Then Ashley asked why he cared. Elam was far away. Karin was safe. The storm will pass them by. Dan looked at her. He said he didn't care because he could see it. If you see the storm and stay silent, you're not neutral. You're an accomplice. Ashley nodded. She didn't argue. Songhua said the trading houses could see it too. They're pilots. They're priests. Maybe not in 4 days, but they'll definitely see it in 2. Dan shook his head. 2 days isn't enough. Evacuating the coastal villages will take 3 days. Getting the fleet to shelter in the fjords, 2. They need 4 days. All 4 they have. Songhua was silent for a moment. Then she said the houses wouldn't issue a warning. It wasn't their business. They were merchants, not rescuers. To warn meant admitting that someone could see better than they could. Sergen Almart would rather let 1,000 people drown than admit that the current lighthouse is working. Silence. Dan said he wouldn't sell this forecast. He'd send it out for free. To everyone. To every signal station. To every ship within range. Mine. Let him ring the bells in every temple he can reach. And Ashley will deliver the letter personally. To King Ilum. Ashley raised an eyebrow. She asked why King Ilum would listen to a red-haired female captain with a letter from an unknown lighthouse keeper. Dan replied that it was from Hyung. Old Hyung from the port of Ilum. He knows the courtiers. He'll confirm it. His word carries some weight with the locals. Ashley nodded. She stood up. She said she'd be ready in an hour. Dan wrote the letter, on the very best paper he had, in Aries' neat handwriting, because no one would be able to make out Dan's handwriting. The letter contained numbers: time of impact, direction, force, area of impact, recommendations. Move the fleet into the fjords. Evacuate the villagers to higher ground. Fortify the port. Close the lower warehouses. 3 days in total, not 4. 3. Because 1 day would be spent traveling to Ashley. The Silver Seagull left the bay at dawn. Ashley was going at full speed. Dan had plotted the route, the shortest one, through the shallows near Recco, through the narrow strait between the cargo islands, where ordinary ships don't go. But the Seagull would make it through. Dan knew its draft. He knew how Ashley handled it. Dan sent out a signal. The lighthouse flashed continuously. Hinari relayed the code. Storm, southwest, 4 days, level 9. Ilum. All ships within a 50-mile radius received the warning. The captains acknowledged it. Some believed it, some didn't. Mina took a boat to the nearest temple island, Kemen. She spoke with the priests. They didn't believe her. Mina insisted. She showed them the records, the numbers. They shook their heads. Mina said that if a storm came and they didn't warn anyone, the blood would be on their hands. The priests turned pale. They rang the bells. The tolling echoed across all the islands. Terra was forging, not for Quran, for Ilum. Iron fastenings for the harbor gates, staples for the warehouses, trifles, but every trifle could save the wall from the wave. Before setting sail, Ashley loaded the iron onto the Seagull. Songhua coordinated the operations. She positioned the ships in the bay. If the storm hit Quran, they had to be ready. Ari recorded everything, every hour. Forecast updates, changes on the map, the behavior of the Leviathans. They were heading into the depths, all 3, at the same time. This confirmed it. The storm would be fierce. Even they were hiding. Ashley reached Ilima in a day and 4 hours, faster than Dan had expected. She found Hyung at the port. The old man read the letter and fell silent. Then he stood up and went to the palace. He knew one of the guards. The guards knew one of the advisors. The advisor passed the letter to the king. The king of Ilima was a cautious man. He read the letter. He looked up at the sky. Clear, sun, a light breeze. Nothing like a storm. He laughed. He set the letter aside. Hyung-gu stood before him, an old, bow-legged fisherman with a weather-beaten face. He said that a year ago, this man had predicted a storm 2 days in advance, down to the hour. The storm broke exactly as he had said. The king looked at Hyung-gu. He asked if he would sign it. Hyung-gu replied that he would. The king thought about it all day. On the second day, clouds appeared over the sea. On the third day, the wind picked up. The king ordered preparations for evacuation. The fleet sailed into the fjords. The coastal villages emptied out. People retreated to the hills. The harbor gates were closed. The lower warehouses were boarded up. On the fourth day, the storm began, exactly at the moment Dan had predicted, 4 hours later than his calculations. Wind force, 10 on the Beaufort scale. The storm surge was 4 meters high. It engulfed the waterfront. It swept away 3 piers. It flooded the lower city. The 2 ships that hadn't retreated to the fjords were smashed against the breakwater. There were no people on them. They had left. Everyone had left. Ilum lost 2 ships and not a single person, not a single one. Dan found out about this 10 days later when Ashley returned. She sailed into Karen Bay and shouted to the whole island from the deck. 0. Not a single one. Dan was standing by the tower window. He heard her. He sat down on the floor. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something else. He sat there thinking about the ferry in Seattle, about the wave that shouldn't have been there, about the people on that ferry whom he hadn't warned because he hadn't seen them, because the data was wrong, or because he'd misread it. He didn't know, and he'd never know. But here he'd seen it, and warned them, and 0. 0 casualties. Erie climbed up to the tower, quietly. She sat down beside him. She didn't say a word, she just sat there. Her brother climbed onto Dan's lap, the boy who didn't talk. He didn't say a word, he just snuggled up. Dan sat on the floor of the lighthouse with a stranger's child on his lap and a silent girl beside him, and for the first time in a year, he wasn't thinking about work. 4 days earlier, Dan had predicted a terrible storm approaching the kingdom of Ilum, with a population of 100,000, and had sent out a free warning across all channels. Ashley delivered the letter to the king of Ilum, and Hyung vouched for Dan. The evacuation was successful. Ilum lost 2 ships, but not a single person died. A month after the storm, the king of Ilum arrived in person on Karan. 3 ships, royal flags. Dan had spotted them on the map a day earlier. Heavy vessels, military, with a powerful biosignature from the crew and weapons, he told Hinari. Hinari turned pale. Then she straightened up and went downstairs to organize the meeting. An hour later, Karan was transformed. Hinari drove people around like the wind drives the waves. The pier was cleared. The tavern was tidied up. The fishermen were dressed in clean clothes. Sonva lined up the signalmen in a row. Ashley washed the silver seagull. Tara closed the horn and put on her only shirt without holes. Ari tidied up the logbook. Mina put on a white temple headband and stood by the dock. Dan didn't come down. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was thinking. The king. Warships. What does he want? What can he offer? What might he demand? Dan sat at the table and ran through the possibilities, as if calculating the pressure before a battle. The ships entered the bay. It was crowded, one after another. Hinari signaled from the pier. Sonva stood nearby and translated the gestures into words the sailors could understand. The royal flagship pulled up to the pier. The gangplank was lowered. King Ilima stepped ashore. Dan saw him from the upper deck, short, sturdy, in a simple traveling cloak, without a crown. Behind him were 4 guards and an advisor. The king looked up at the tower, at the light of the crystal. Then he looked around. The pier, the houses, the smokehouse, the tavern, the smithy, people, children, boats. A year ago, there was nothing here. The king climbed up to the tower, alone. The guards remained below. Hinari wanted to go up with him, but Dan sent word via a messenger that he would receive the king alone. Hinari looked up. Dan knew she would hold it against him later. The king entered the upper room. He saw a thin man in a tattered cloak, a table with a shimmering map, a stack of journals against the wall, 3 cats that had appeared in the tower from who knows where. One was sleeping on the magazines. The second was sitting on the windowsill. The third approached the king and nudged his boot with its head. The king looked at the cat, then at Dan. Dan didn't bow, not because he was proud. He simply didn't know how to bow to kings in this world, and he decided it was better to stand upright than to bow incorrectly. The king walked over to the table. He looked at the map, for a long time, in silence. Then he turned to Dan and asked what he wanted in exchange for saving Ilum. Dan thought, 10 seconds, maybe 15. He could have asked for a lot. Gold, ships, soldiers to defend Quran, recognition, a title, land. Any of these options would have been reasonable. Any of them would have strengthened Quran. Dan said 2 things. First, the right to free trade in Ilum's ports for Quran's ships. No duties, no restrictions. So that Ashley and the other captains could freely enter and leave the ports. This would give Quran a trading network, an economy, independence from any trading house. Second, peace. Don't go to war with anyone this winter. Dan put it simply, Because war at sea means ships. Ships are dots on his map. Dots he has to track, warn about, defend. If Ilum goes to war, the number of dots doubles. Warships don't listen to forecasts. They go where they're ordered, and they sink. And Dan has to watch them sink because they didn't heed his warning. He has enough work as it is. He doesn't need a war on top of that. The king was silent. Then he asked if he was serious. Dan nodded. Absolutely. The king looked at him, then at the map, then at the cat on the magazine covers. Then he laughed, quietly. He said that in 30 years of his reign, no one had ever asked him for peace. Usually they ask for war. Dan shrugged. He said there were no wars on the map. He had never seen peace. The king nodded. He said he agreed. Trade privileges for Karen, and peace in the winter. They didn't shake hands. They didn't sign a treaty. The king simply said yes, and Dan wrote it down in the log. Before leaving, the king asked about something else. What were those creatures, the black dots on the map? Dan explained. Leviathans. The king turned pale. He asked if he could find out where they were now. Dan showed him. 4 dots, 2 far to the south, 1 to the west, 1 alarmingly close to the route the king himself had taken. It had passed beneath his ships while he was climbing the tower's staircase. The king looked at the dot, then at Dan. He said he needed a beacon like that in Ilum. Dan replied that they didn't build beacons. They already exist. 7 of them. Ancient. 6 in ruins. This one is the only one that works. But maybe someday others will be found. The king went back down. As he was leaving, he turned around. He said that if Dan ever needed a fleet, just give a wink. Dan nodded, noted, ally, Ilum, resources, fleet, condition, constant exchange of information. The royal ships left the next morning. Dan gave them a 3-day forecast and a route to bypass the Leviathan to the west. The captain of the flagship came aboard to say goodbye. He said that in 40 years at sea, this was the first time he knew exactly where these creatures were swimming. He said he couldn't decide what he feared more, them or what was now known about them. Dan replied that knowledge didn't increase the danger, only the perception of danger. The captain thought about it and agreed. After the king's departure, Dan convened a council. It was the first time he had called it that, the council. Hinari, Sonva, Ashley, Tara, Eri, Mina, 6 women. Each was responsible for her own area. Hinari, for the shore and the people. Sonva, for training and navigation. Ashley is responsible for foreign trade and intelligence. Tara, for construction and engineering. Eri, for data and the archives. Mina was in charge of relations with the temples and the people. Dan said it was time to expand. The repeater was working. Tara had forged 4 frames. There were enough crystal shards for 6. We needed to set up outposts on the neighboring islands, the 3 closest ones. Kemen to the south, Redu to the east, Deadstone to the north. Each outpost needs someone who knows the code, someone who can receive the beacon's signal and relay it. Each outpost needs a frame with a shard. Each outpost increases the range by 30 to 40 miles. With 3 outposts, Karen will cover half of the northern waters with its signal. Sonva said she has 11 trained signalers. 3 can be sent to the outposts, but they need to be fed, supplied, protected, and that costs money. Ashley said that Ilum's trading privileges give her access to the market. In 2 months, she can earn enough to support 3 outposts for half a year. Tara said the frames are ready. She can forge more, if there's copper. Copper is expensive, but Ashley knows where to buy it cheaper. Eri said she needs assistance. The volume of data is growing. 1 person can't handle it, even with her memory. She needs 3 people who can write and count. Mina said there are novices on Chemine who can do both. She can bring them. Dan listened. He took notes. Every sentence. Every problem. Every solution. It wasn't a meeting. It was a system. Every part knew its function. Every part complemented the other. He didn't create it on purpose. It grew. Out of necessity. Out of hunger. Out of fear. Out of the crackling sound in the barrel that the old man in the wet raincoat had brought a year ago. Dan concluded the meeting with a single sentence. He said that in 6 months, Karin would no longer be a dot on the map, but a network, and that this network would not belong to him, not to the king, not to the house, to everyone who goes out to sea. Hinare looked at him. She said he was speaking beautifully again, but someone would have to wash his raincoat, because it smelled like a wet cat. Everyone laughed, even Sonwa. Dan saw Sonwa laugh for the first time. She covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes shone with warmth. Later that same night, Dan made an entry in the log. Year 1, 13th month. The council has been formed. 6 operators. Network expansion begins. Alliance with Ilum confirmed. The enemy is silent. The crystal is stable. Karin's population is 106. 23 ships are at anchor. 4% of northern trade passes through us. Forecast for the future. Growth. Dan put down the pen. He looked out the window. The moon hung over the sea, a quiet night, a rare occurrence. A cat purred on the windowsill. Downstairs, in the tavern, a light was on. Someone was singing, badly, but loudly. Probably Ashley. Dan closed his journal and went to bed. For the first time in a year, he didn't dream of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration control room. King Ilima arrived in Karan in person and granted duty-free trade privileges in exchange for saving the coast. Dan asked for peace for the winter. A council of 6 women was formed, and a decision was made to expand the network of relay stations to 3 neighboring islands. Karan's population reached 106, and 4% of northern trade passed through the island. In the 15th month, Surgeon Almar struck. Not with a fleet, not with a knife, with money. Dan saw this not on a map but in Aries' journal. Aerie tracked trade flows, which ships arrived, what they brought in, what they took out, prices, volumes. She did this not because Dan asked her to. She did it because numbers were her language, and the numbers spoke. In 2 weeks, the price of copper in the nearest ports tripled. Copper, the very kind needed for repeater frames. Tara couldn't buy any. Not for silver, not for gold. The sellers threw up their hands. None. Sold out. Who bought it all up was unknown. Then the wood disappeared. Construction wood. Shipbuilding wood. The port warehouses in Ilime and Kalmo were emptied in a week. Someone had bought it all up. Then the craftsmen left. The 2 carpenters Hyung had brought from the mainland received offers. Good ones. Twice what Karan paid. They apologized, packed their things, left. The netmaker followed them. Then one of the fishermen. Then 2 more. Dan sat in the tower and watched as the dots on the map left the bay. One after another. Not quickly. One a week. But steadily. It wasn't an attack. It was a stranglehold. Surgeon Almar didn't touch Karen. He was clearing everything away around Karen. Buying up resources. Buying off people. Shutting down markets. Pressuring suppliers. For 3 weeks now, not a single ship carrying supplies had arrived at Karen. The fishermen were still going out to sea. There was still fish, but without iron, there was nothing to repair the boats with. Without wood, there was nothing to build with. Without copper, there was nothing to make transmitters. Hinari climbed up to the tower, angry. Silent anger is worse than a scream. She said there was panic down below. People were afraid, whispering, saying that the House of the Elder Water would starve them to death, that they needed to surrender, accept the offer, while they're still offering. Dan listened. Then he asked how much supplies they had. Hinari counted. Smoked fish for 2 months, flour for 3 weeks. There's enough water, the spring won't run dry. There's enough iron in the forge for minor repairs. No wood, no copper. Dan nodded. He asked where Ashley was now. Hinari replied that she was on the route. She left 3 days ago for the port of Midden. Dan looked at the map. He found the silver seagull marker. She was heading back. Fast. Non-stop. So she hadn't been trading. So the market in Midden was closed too. Ashley returned in the evening. She burst into the tower. It was the first time Dan had seen her without a smile. She said that Midden was closed. Como port was closed. The Western Spit was closed. It was the same everywhere. They won't sell to Karen ships. They won't buy from them. The port wardens look away and say there's nothing they can do. An order. Whose order? A silver drop in a circle. The House of the Elder Water. Ashley sat down on the floor. It was the first time he'd seen her sitting on the floor. She always stood. She was always moving. And now she sat there in silence. Dan called a council meeting. 6 women climbed up into the tower. There wasn't enough room. Tara sat on the windowsill. Mina on a stair-step. Dan laid out the situation. An economic blockade. Resources cut off. People are leaving. If nothing changes in 2 months, Karen will return to where he started. The rock with the lighthouse. One man. Silence. Songfa spoke, quietly, calmly. She said she knew Surgen. She'd worked for him for 10 years. She knew what he was thinking. Surgen doesn't destroy. Surgen absorbs. He suffocates until the victim asks for help, and then he extends a hand, with conditions that are no longer up for discussion. Dan asked how long it would be before Surgen came to take his hand. Songfa replied that it would be a month, maybe a month and a half. He would wait until things got really tough. Dan nodded. A month. They had a month to find a solution. He turned to the map. He stared at it for a long time. The others were silent. Then Dan said he'd spotted something. To the southeast of Karan lay an archipelago. 6 small islands, uninhabited. On the trading houses' maps, they're marked as a danger zone. Reefs, shallow waters, currents. No one goes there. But Dan had been observing that area for a year. The currents there are predictable. There are reefs, but there's a passage between them. Narrow, but passable for ships with a shallow draft. And between the islands is a calm lagoon, sheltered from storms, with clear water. And judging by the map, it's home to one of the densest concentrations of fish in the entire northern region. Why? Because no one sails there. The fish have been breeding in peace for decades. Dan pointed to the map. The Quiet Islands. That's what he called them. Sonva looked. She said there was a passage through the reefs. She'd heard of it. It's a legend among the house pilots. No one has tried it. Too dangerous. Dan said that for Ashley, that wasn't a limit. Her draft, her handling, his current forecast. They'll make it through. And there's fish there. Lots of fish. Enough to feed Karen without supplies from the mainland, and to trade fish with those who dare to come. And someone will dare. Because hunger is stronger than the fear of the trading house. Ashley raised her head. A gleam appeared in her eyes. She asked when to set out. Dan said tomorrow, but not alone, with Sonva. Sonva knows the reefs from stories. Ashley knows her ship. Dan will chart a precise course through the strait, minute by minute, degree by degree. Sonva and Ashley exchanged glances. Months of conflict, arguments over routes, over speed and safety. Now they needed both. Sonva nodded. Ashley nodded. In the morning, the Silver Seagull left the bay with 2 captains on board. Dan stood at the helm and steered the ship. Signal after signal. Hinari relayed the code. 2 degrees to port. Straight ahead. Stop. Wait. The current is changing. Now. Forward. 3 degrees to starboard. Shallow. Careful. Straight ahead. The Silver Seagull made its way through the reefs like a thread through the eye of a needle. 4 hours. Dan didn't leave the chart table. Sweat trickled down his temples. The crystal glowed brightly. The map showed every reef, every rock, every shift in the current. Dan read it like a musical score, and Ashley played. They made it through. The Seagull entered the lagoon. Calm water, sun, fish splashed at the surface. There were so many that the water looked silvery. Later, Ashley told how Sonva stood at the bow and cried. Silently, soundlessly, tears simply streamed down her cheeks. For 10 years she had steered ships along routes that killed, and here was a route that saved lives, and she had sailed it. By evening they returned with a hold full of fish. 2 days later, Dan sent 3 fishing boats to the Quiet Islands with a route map. They returned with a catch the likes of which Karen had never seen. Sergen Almar's blockade had cracked. There was so much fish that Hinari sent the surplus to Ilum, for free, as a gesture, as a signal. Karen is alive. Karen is feeding. Come. Sergen Almar began an economic blockade of Karen by buying up resources and closing ports to Karen ships. Dan found a way out by opening a safe passage to the uninhabited archipelago of the Quiet Islands with its vast fish stocks. Ashley and Samba worked together for the first time, navigating the ship through the reef, following Dan's minute-by-minute instructions, and returned with a full hold. In the 17th month, Dan installed the first relay station outside Quran. Copper was found, not on the market, in the reefs of the Quiet Islands. Tara rappelled down into the lagoon and discovered the wreckage of an old ship on the seabed, an ancient one. Perhaps from the pre-sea era. The hull had rotted away, but the copper plating lay on the bottom like treasure, greened, heavy, pure copper. Tara hauled up as much as she could. It was enough for 12 frames, with some to spare. The first outpost was established on the island of Kemen, southward. Mina returned to her temple island not as a scout, but as an ambassador. She brought a frame with a fragment. She installed it on the temple roof. The fragment flickered, faintly, but apparently from Quran in clear weather. And in clear weather, the flicker of the lighthouse was visible from Kemen. The chain was working. Dan was flashing. Kemen was repeating. Ships to the south were picking up the signal. Mina taught 3 novices the code, young girls with quick hands and good memories. They took turns on duty, day and night. Karen's signal now reached 30 miles further south, a second post on Rado, eastward. Sonhua led the team herself. Rado was a barren, rocky island with a single cove and a water source. Sonhua left 2 trained signalers there, a young man and a young woman from among the refugees. Young, strong, unafraid of solitude. They set up the frame on the rock. The shard flickered. The eastern channel opened. The third outpost was on Dead Rock, northward. This one was the most difficult. Dead Rock stood in an area of strong currents. The approach was dangerous. But with Dan's forecast, Ashley found a window. 4 hours of calm between the shifting tidal currents. It was enough to drop off the people and set up the frame. 3 stations, 3 directions. The signal radius increased from 50 miles to 120. Nearly a quarter of the northern waters were covered. Dan stood at the table and looked at the map. 3 small lights flickered around Karen. South, east, north. Like satellites. Like stations. Like NOAA buoys, only living. With people inside. He made a note. Network launched. 3 nodes. 24% coverage of the northern region. Signal stability satisfactory. 1.5-second delay per node. Acceptable. Next stage. Expansion to 6 nodes. In the 18th month, what Dan had both waited for and feared happened. Sergen Almar came in person, not with a fleet, with a single ship, black sails, a silver drop on the flag. The brig entered Karen Bay at dawn. Dan had seen it on the map 2 days earlier. A lone, heavy ship, on a straight course, no stops, no reconnaissance. A man who knows exactly where he's going and why. Dan didn't hide, didn't set a trap, didn't call Ashley to intercept. He stood by the window and waited. Sergen Almar climbed the tower stairs, slowly, with a silver cane, 60 years old, elegant, gray hair, slender hands. The face of a man accustomed to deciding the fates of others and considering it the natural order of things. He entered the upper room. He looked at the map, at the crystal, at the journals by the wall, at Dan. He looked for a long time. Then he said that Dan had surprised him. Twice. The first time was when he refused. The second was when he survived. Dan was silent. Sergen continued. He spoke quietly, almost gently. He said he understood Dan. He really did understand. A young man on a lighthouse, seeing the world from above, wanting justice, wanting everyone to know what he knows. A beautiful idea. But the world doesn't work that way. The world works on order. Order is when some know and others don't. Some decide and others obey. The trading houses aren't perfect. Sergen isn't perfect. But without them, there's chaos. Without a monopoly on the routes, everyone will go wherever they please. And drown. Because not everyone can read the sea. Dan listened. Then he said that Sergen was right. Not everyone can read the sea. That's why we need a system that reads for them. An open one. An accessible one. One that belongs to no one. Sergen shook his head. He said that an open system is a utopia. Someone will always take control. If not him, then someone else. Worse than him. At least he, Sergen, isn't a killer. Dan looked him straight in the eye. He said that Sergen had sent a killer to Karen 4 months ago. Sergen didn't look away. He said it was a mistake. He admits it. A mistake. It won't happen again. He didn't come with a knife. He came with a proposal. A final one. Dan listened. Sergen proposed a division. Karen remains independent. It gives forecasts to whomever it wants, but it doesn't expand its network southward. The southern waters remain under the House of the Elder Water. The north belongs to Dan, the south to Sergen. Peaceful coexistence. The border along the 26th parallel, Dan thought. The proposal was reasonable, pragmatic. It gave Karen security, removed the threat, allowed it to grow in the north without conflict, and left the south in the dark. Thousands of fishermen, dozens of ports, people who drown because the House of the Elder Water sells them false forecasts, or sells them none at all. Dan looked at the map. Another front was forming in the south, a routine one, not deadly, but without warning someone would get caught in it. Someone would lose a boat, maybe a life. Dan turned to Sergen. He said no, quietly, without a logbook in his hands, just no. Storm warnings are free, for everyone, always. It's not up for negotiation. Sergen was silent. His face didn't change. He had expected that answer. He nodded, said it was a shame, and that Dan would regret it. He turned around, left. His cane tapped on the steps. The brig weighed anchor and sailed out of the bay. Hinati stood next to Dan. She had heard everything. She was standing on the stairs beneath the window. She said that Dan could have agreed. Half the world is better than nothing. Dan shook his head. He said that half the world is half a lie. Either information is free for everyone, or it's a weapon for someone. There is no middle ground. Hinati was silent for a moment. Then she said he was right. But that being right is hard. Dan nodded. He said he knew. He wrote it down in his log. A personal meeting with Sergen Almar. Proposal for a division. Rejected. Expected response. Military operation. The Elder Waterhouse Fleet. Duration, 3 to 4 months. Until the end of the navigation season. Prepare defenses. Defense method. Informational. Dan closed the logbook. He looked at the map. Sergen's brig was heading south. Fast. Non-stop. A man who knew exactly what he was going to do next. 3 repeaters were installed on neighboring islands, and Karan's signal network covered a quarter of the northern waters. Sergen Almar arrived in person and proposed dividing spheres of influence. Dan refused to compromise, upholding the principle of free storm warnings for all, and noted in his log that he expected a military response. The fleet of the House of the Elder Waters set sail at the beginning of the 21st month. 12 ships, 4 combat brigades, 8 heavy transports carrying soldiers, about 600 men. Dan saw them on the map 3 days later, 12 hot, heavy dots, in formation, heading northeast, toward Karan. He sat at the table and calculated, 12 ships isn't an attack, it's war. Karan has no fleet, no army, no walls. It has a dock, a tavern, a smithy, 120 civilians, fishermen, women, children, against 600 soldiers on 12 ships. Dan called a council, explained. Hinari turned pale. Then she clenched her jaw and asked what to do. Ashley said the Silver Seagull could take some of the people away, women and children, to Ilum, under the kings. Dan shook his head. He said it wasn't necessary. No one was leaving, because Sergen's fleet wouldn't make it. Everyone looked at him. Dan showed the map. A squall was coming from the north. Not an ordinary front, a deep cyclone. One of those that form once a year, force 8 or 9. It would hit in 2 days. Sergen's fleet would be out on the open sea by then, between the southern islands and Karan. Nowhere to take shelter. Nowhere to hide. Dan had known this for 3 days. Sergen didn't know. His pilots couldn't see that far. His bribed priests looked at the sky and saw clouds, not isowars. Dan could have warned them. He could have flashed the lighthouse, sent a signal. Storm from the north. Get out. Take cover. He could have saved 600 people, just as he had saved Ilum. The silence in the tower was so thick you could hear a cat breathing on the windowsill. Sonka spoke first. She asked quietly if he would warn them. Dan was silent, for a long time. Then he said that storm warnings are free, for everyone, always. That's his rule, his principle. He repeated it to everyone who came to Karan. But the lighthouse signals to those who look, who listen, who know the code. Sergen's fleet doesn't know the code. It doesn't receive the signals. It doesn't listen. Dan doesn't hide information. He simply doesn't force it on those who don't want to accept it. The lighthouse will flash as it does every day. The code will be the same. A storm from the north, force 8, 2 days. Every captain within the signal's range will receive a warning. Sergen's captains too, if they can read. Dan looked at the map, then at the council. Hinari stared at him without blinking. Ashley was silent. Ari was taking notes. Mina was whispering something silently. Tara was tapping her fingers on the windowsill. Sonwa nodded. She understood. Dan wasn't lying. He wasn't hiding anything. He wasn't choosing who to save. He was doing what he always did, broadcasting data, openly, to everyone. And from there, it was up to each person. Dan began to signal. The beacon flashed. Kemen repeated. Rado repeated. Deadstone repeated. Storm, north, 2 days, force 8. All ships take shelter. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Sergen's 12 ships continued on their previous course. There were no signalmen on the masts trained in the Karen code. They saw the lighthouse flashing, but they didn't understand it. To them, it was just a light, a flicker. The lighthouse is blinking. So what? Lighthouses blink. At the end of the second day, a squall struck. Dan stood by the north window. The sky darkened in 2 hours. The wind picked up. The waves grew. The Koran shook. The tower roared. But the bay was sheltered from the north by a rocky outcrop. The ships in the bay rocked but held their ground. Songva had secured them with triple ropes. People sat in the tavern and in their homes. They waited. Sergen's fleet had been caught in a squall on the open sea. 12 ships against a 9-point storm. Dan saw it on the map. The dots twitched. They scattered. The formation fell apart. Some dots stopped. Then they vanished. A ship sinks fast when a wave hits its side. The storm lasted 12 hours. By morning, the map showed 7 dots out of 12. 5 ships were lost. The remaining 7 were scattered. Some were drifting without masts. The fleet was no more. There was a handful of wrecked ships trying to find the shore. Dan stood at the table. His face was ashen. He looked at the empty spaces on the map where 5 dots had been. People, hundreds of people, who had come to kill him, and who had drowned because they didn't know the code, because their commander didn't want to listen to the beacon. Hinari came in. She stood beside him. She didn't speak. She just stood there. Dan said quietly that he hadn't done anything. Hinari replied that that was exactly what was tormenting him. Dan nodded. She was right. He could have done more. He could have sent Ashley out to meet the fleet with a warning. He could have flashed the beacon brighter, longer, more often. He could have gone beyond protocol. He didn't. He did exactly what he always did. And exactly what he always did turned out to be not enough for those who didn't listen. Dan made an entry in the log. The punitive fleet of the House of the Elder Water. 12 vessels. 5 ships lost. Cause: Stormfront. The warning was broadcast in standard mode. Not received. He added a single line. I should have done more. Then he crossed it out. Then he wrote it again. Then he left it. The next day, Ashley set sail. Not to trade, to search for survivors. The Silver Seagull passed through the storm zone, found 3 wrecked ships, debris, bodies in the water, and a lifeboat with 14 survivors. Among them was Surgeon Almar. At dawn on the 3rd day, Ashley entered Karen Bay. Dan came down. For the first time in a long while, he truly came down from the tower. Not for muscles, not for a council at the base. He went ashore and walked toward the pier. Hinari walked beside him. She was the one who had persuaded him to come down. Sergen stood on the pier, wet, in torn clothes, without a cane, without silver, without a fleet, without soldiers. An old man on a foreign pier. He looked at Dan. Dan looked at him. Sergen dropped to his knees, not out of weakness, out of understanding. He asked quietly what Dan would do to him. Dan was silent. He looked at this man, at his trembling hands, at his wet, gray hair, at eyes in which there was neither malice nor pride, only weariness. Dan took off his cloak, worn, the very one in which he had woken up on the lighthouse stairs 21 months ago. He draped it over Sergen's shoulders. He said it was nothing. Go warm up. Hinari has soup at the tavern, and tomorrow, if you want, he'll teach him how to read a map. Sergen looked at him. Then he covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. He was crying for the first time in 40 years. The House of the Elder Water's fleet of 12 ships set out for Karan, but ran into a squall that Dan had warned about in a routine broadcast over the signal network. 5 ships were lost. Ashley fished the survivors out of the water, including Surgeon Almar himself. Dan met the defeated enemy at the pier, threw his cloak over him, and offered him a bowl of soup and a lesson in map reading. Surgeon Almar lived on Karen for 3 weeks. The first week he said nothing. He sat in the tavern, he ate soup, he stared at the wall, he slept on a bench. People around him gave him sidelong glances but left him alone. Hinari told everyone that the old man was a guest, not a prisoner, not an enemy, a guest. In the second week, he went up to the tower. Dan was sitting at the table. The map glowed. Surgeon stood in the doorway and watched. Then he approached, sat down on a stone by the wall. He was silent for an hour, 2, 3. He watched Dan work, how he read the lines, how he wrote them down, how he calculated. On the 3rd day, he asked what this blue line meant, the one that curves toward the east. Dan explained. An isobar, a line of equal pressure. The curve means the wind is picking up. Surgeon nodded. He asked more, and more, and more. He was learning. A 60-year-old man who had ruled the most powerful house in the world sat on the stone floor and learned to read a pressure map, like a child, without shame, without resistance. Sonva watched. One day, Dan saw her on the stairs. She was standing there, watching Sergen at the map. Her face looked strange. Dan asked what she was thinking. Sonva said she had worked for this man for 10 years. For 10 years, she had been afraid of him. She hated him. She hated herself for working for him. And now he was sitting on the floor, asking what an isobar is. And for some reason, it didn't hurt her. Dan said that data has no memory. An isobar doesn't know who's reading it. To it, there are no villains or heroes. There is pressure. Sonkva looked at him. She said that sometimes he says things that sound wise, but in reality, it's just meteorology. Dan replied that he didn't see the difference. In the 3rd week, Sergen told Dan he was leaving. He'd return to the house, to what was left of the house. 5 lost ships, a mutiny of captains, debts, disgrace. But the house is still alive, and Sergen is its head. He said he would no longer fight Karan, not because he had lost, because he understood. A monopoly on lies requires constant effort. A monopoly on truth is impossible, because the truth cannot be hidden when the lighthouse is burning. Dan asked what Surgeon would do. Surgeon replied that he would open the routes, the southern ones, the ones the house had kept secret. He would show them to everyone, because if the house sold the routes and Quran gave out forecasts for free, the house would go bankrupt. But if the house started making money from something else, from wiring, from training, from maintenance, then, perhaps, he would survive. Dan nodded. He said that Surgeon could install a repeater on one of the southern islands. Dan would provide a crystal shard. Ramatara would forge it in a day. Surgeon would receive Quran's signal in real time and relay it onward. The southern waters would be under control. Surgeon was silent for a long time. Then he said that Dan was a terrifying man, not because he knew how to destroy, but because he knew how to forgive, and that made one want to become a better person. Surgeon sailed away on his only surviving brig, with a crystal shard in a copper frame, with 3 former soldiers who decided to stay with him, and with a journal, a thin one, in a leather binding, a gift from Airy, blank pages. Surgeon promised to record data every day. Dan recorded it. Former enemy transitions to network node status. Southern direction. Coverage increases by 30%. Unforeseen result. On the 23rd month, Dan opened the journal in the morning and froze. On the blank page he had left last night, lines were appearing. Lines. Not his handwriting, not Aries' handwriting, not ink. The lines were glowing. Pale blue, like lines on a map. Isobars. But different. A different region. Different coordinates. A different scale. Dan looked up. He looked at the crystal. The crystal was pulsing. Not with a steady light as usual, but in bursts. Rhythmically. Like a heart. Dan placed his palm on the crystal. The map flashed. Brighter than ever. And at the edge of the map, in the far east, he saw a glimmer. A second beacon. Small. Faint. Flickering. But alive. Someone on the other side of the world had activated the second crystal. Someone had touched it, and the crystal had lit up, just as the Quran crystal had lit up for Dan. Dan stood at the table and watched the distant light. His hands didn't tremble. His mind was clear. He understood what this meant. The network. The Primorskaya network. It was beginning to awaken. 1 beacon sees a quarter of the world. 2 beacons, half. 7, all of it. Every storm, every current, every leviathan, every ship. No fisherman will set out to sea without warning. No village will go under without the ringing of bells. He made an entry in the log. Day 690. Signal from a second lighthouse detected. Direction, east. Distance unknown. Signal weak but steady. Karen's crystal is responding. One-way communication. For now. He finished writing. It's beginning. Then he put a period. He looked at the distant flickering light. Somewhere to the east, by yet another map, stood yet another man. Perhaps he was just as lost as Dan had been 23 months ago. Maybe just as hungry. Maybe thinking the same thing. That this was his job. Sergen Almar spent 3 weeks on Karen and learned the basics of reading a pressure map. He left with a shard of crystal and a promise to open the southern routes, becoming the southern node of the network. In the 23rd month, Dan discovered that a second pre-sea beacon had been activated in the far east. 2 years and 3 months. Dan stood at the table in the upper room of the beacon and counted. Data for 27 months. 819 log entries. 4,000 forecasts. Of those, 41 were accuracy, 98.97%. Karen was visible outside the window. Not a rock, a town. Small, winding, smelling of smoked fish and mountain iron. But a town. 142 people. 31 ships in the bay, 7 signal stations. 4 on the islands. 1 at Surgeons in the south. 2 on the mainland, in Ilam. The signal covers more than half of the northern waters. 15% of all northern trade passes through Karen. Not because Karen lies on a convenient route, but because Karen knows where it's safe. Dan closed the logbook. He went downstairs. Down the staircase he was no longer afraid of. The steps were the same, narrow, no railing, but his feet knew every one of them. They were waiting for him downstairs. Not because he'd called, because today was the day. A special one. Tara had finished the last frame. Not a relay frame, another one, a big one. She'd been working on it for 3 months. A copper structure the size as tall as a person, with 6 holders for crystal shards, a directional antenna. Dan himself didn't believe it would work, but the data said it should. The shards in the copper frame resonated with the crystal. The more shards, the stronger the signal. 6 shards in a directional frame could transmit a signal not 30, but 300 miles, directly, to the second beacon, a connection, a working, two-way. Tara stood by her creation. Her hands were burned. Her face was calm. She looked at the frame as if it were a child she had raised and finally brought to maturity. Dan approached. He looked at the structure. Perfect. Every seam, every bend, every bracket. He said the frame was made for a left-handed person. Tara looked at him. He explained. The angle of the brackets, the distance between them. Everything was calculated so that a left-handed person could insert and remove the shards without having to reposition the tool. Tara wasn't just making a frame. She was making a frame that was comfortable for her to work with, because she would be maintaining the network of repeaters, because that was her job, her calling. Tara was silent. Then she said quietly that her husband used to say, "A good blacksmith forges for others, but a great one forges for himself, because he knows what he wants." Dan nodded. He said she was a great blacksmith. Tara turned away, but Dan saw her run the back of her hand over her eyes. The frame was lifted onto the upper platform. It was set up next to the crystal. Dan inserted 6 shards. They began to flicker, brightly, much brighter than in the small repeater frames. The light from them shone toward the east, a narrow beam, like a searchlight. Dan placed his palm on the crystal. The map flashed, and in the far east, the light of the second beacon flickered. It grew brighter, and Dan saw a line stretch out from that light, toward him, thin, pale, but visible, a connection. Dan began to flash, slowly, a simple code. Dot, dash, dot, dash. I'm here, I see you. Pause. Then a reply, from the east. Slow, hesitant. The rhythm was off, not Quran's code, a different one, but understandable. I'm here too. Dan stood by the table, tears streaming down his face. He didn't notice anything. Hinari stood beside him, Sunva, on the stairs, Ashley, by the window, Tara, by her frame, Ari, at the table with an open magazine, Mina, on her knees at the small altar that Dan had set up for her in the corner of the courtyard, the place where she prayed, looking at what she was praying to. Now she prayed with her eyes open. 6 women, 1 beacon. One man had come here, soaked and hungry, with a tag around his neck. Dan wiped his face. He turned to Ari. He said she needed to write it down. Ari was already writing. She began to write as soon as she saw the first flash in the east. Every symbol, every pause, every answer. Dan sat down on the floor. He was tired. His body ached. He had barely slept for the past month. Hinari sat down next to him. Just like that first night when she stayed in the tower, without touching him, just sitting there. Then she touched him, resting her head on his shoulder. Dan sat on the floor of the lighthouse next to the woman and watched as 2 lights flickered on the map, his and the stranger's, and the thin line of connection between them. 2 lighthouses out of 7, 2 islands, 2 people who see what no one else sees. Somewhere in the world, 5 more crystals lay, in ruins, in oblivion, waiting. Dan didn't know who would light them, didn't know when, but he knew one thing. The Primors had left behind a system that activates only when there is a person humble enough to withstand it. Dan wasn't humble. He was meticulous, stubborn, a poor sleeper, a poor eater. He talked to people as if they were buoys, but his last thought before death was of the other sailors, and the crystal remembered that. In the morning, Dan got up early. He went out onto deck. The sun was rising over the sea, golden, warm. Down below, the bay was waking up. Fishermen were heading to their boats. Children were running toward the water. Smoke billowed from the smokehouse. The sound of hammering came from the smithy. Tara was already at work, as always, the first to rise. The Silver Seagull had set sail. The Ashley set out on a reconnaissance mission to the eastern waters, to search for the second lighthouse, to find the one who lit it, to bring back news. Songpa stood on the pier and briefed the new group of signalers, 7 of them, the largest group yet. Mina was making her way down to the temple boat. She was sailing to Kim. She carried the word. The sea breathes. The lighthouse sees. Do not be afraid. Ari sat in the tower. She was writing. The boy was beside her. He had spoken a month ago. His first word was light. His second was sister. Hinari stood on the shore and shouted to someone that the boat was tied up crookedly. Her voice carried across the bay, loud, alive. Dan stood above and watched it all. The city that had grown out of nothing, out of a barrel of cod and crooked letters on wet stone. He took out a journal, opened a blank page, wrote, Day 819, pressure stable, no fronts, winds southeasterly, 3 knots. Water temperature rising, spring, leviathans in the south, 2 objects, stationary. Quran's population, 142 people, ships, 31, signal stations, 7. 54% of northern waters covered. Active lighthouses, 2 out of 7. Communication with the second lighthouse established. The operator of the second lighthouse is unknown. A search expedition has set out. The off-season continues. 3rd year. Storms aren't following the old charts, but the new ones. We have new charts. He finished writing the last line. Forecast for today. Clear. It's safe to go out. Dan closed the logbook. He placed his palm on the crystal, warm, like a stranger's hand, just like on the first day. The map lit up. Blue swirls, red arcs, black dots. The world. His world. Not the one he was born into, the one he'd stayed in. By his own choice, not by force. The tag around his neck signified a life sentence. Dan no longer saw it as a sentence. He saw it as a position. Keeper. Karen. His job. His data. His people. Somewhere to the east, a second light flickered. Where elsewhere in the world, 5 more crystals were sleeping. They would wake up. Not today, not tomorrow, but they would wake up. Because the world is full of people who think of others, who calculate, not predict, who keep records every day, who share their forecasts for free, and then write a single word in a journal. Good. The Karen lighthouse was burning, a steady blue light over the gray sea. Below, fishermen were leaving the cove. They knew where to sail. They knew when to return. They knew the lighthouse was burning. And as long as it burns, they can go out to sea. Dan removed his hand from the crystal. The light remained. For the first time, the map hadn't gone out. The crystal glowed on its own. Dan looked at it. Warm, alive, glowing without his help. He understood. The lighthouse no longer depended solely on him. The lighthouse had embraced the island, the people on it, the system they had built. The crystal glowed for Karen, for everyone here. Dan sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall. He closed his eyes. The sun warmed his face through the east window. Voices came from below. A knock, the splash of water, Hinari's cry, Ashley's laughter, the clang of Tara's anvil. Karen was alive, and Dan, for the first time in 2 years, just sat there. He wasn't counting. He wasn't writing anything down. He wasn't looking at the map. He was just sitting on the warm stone, listening to the life of the city he had built, without ever leaving the tower. A cat came, the 3rd one, the one that was always rubbing against his legs. She lay down on his lap. It purred. Dan opened his eyes. He looked out the window. The sea glistened in the sun. Far off on the horizon, a ship was sailing. Small, fast, maybe a merchant ship, maybe a fishing boat. It sailed confidently, in a straight line, not wandering, not afraid, because it knew where to go, because the lighthouse was burning.